When the world is loud and your thoughts won't stop, a quiet story can be like a warm blanket for the soul. In these 3 hours of sleep-inducing Zen stories and soothing Buddhist teachings, you will find calm in every word. Each tale carries a soft lesson, a gentle truth, and a peaceful rhythm perfect for letting go of the day. As your breathing slows and your mind softens, let these stories guide you into a deep and restful sleep where peace begins with a whisper. Let's begin. The bamboo that bent in the storm. A fierce storm swept across a quiet forest near a village nestled at the foot of the hills. Thunder echoed through the valley, lightning cracked the sky, and the wind roared like an angry sea. Trees groaned under the force of the storm. Branches broke, leaves scattered. Some of the strongest trees fell. But deep in the forest, a grove of bamboo stood tall and silent. Though the wind pressed hard against it, the bamboo did not fight back. It bent, it swayed, it moved with the wind, not against it. When the storm passed, the bamboo rose once more, unharmed. A monk who had been traveling through the forest had taken shelter beside the bamboo that night. As the storm raged, he sat quietly, watching the bamboo dance in the darkness. He felt afraid at first. The wind shook his robe, and the thunder rattled the earth beneath him. But as he watched the bamboo bend without breaking, something inside him shifted. His fear softened, his breath slowed. He realized that the bamboo was not weak, it was wise. The next day, when he reached the village, the monk shared his experience. He said, "Many trees stood tall and proud, but they snapped when the storm demanded they move. Only the bamboo lived through the storm without damage because it did not resist." The villagers listened, quiet and thoughtful. The monk continued, "When we face hardship, loss, anger, pain, we often try to hold firm. We clench our hearts and tighten our minds. But when we do this, we are like the stiff trees. We crack under the weight. If instead we allow ourselves to bend, to feel what comes without fear or resistance, we survive, we heal, we grow." From then on, whenever life felt too heavy, the villagers would walk to the bamboo grove. They would stand beneath its swaying stalks and remember the lesson it had taught them, not with loud words, but with quiet movement. Moral of the story: true strength lives in softness. Those who bend with life's storms do not break, they endure with grace, resilience, and peace. The next story is called Silence Beneath the Bodhi Tree. In the town of Uruvela, long ago, a prince-turned-monk sat beneath a great fig tree near the banks of the river. The sun rose and set, the wind moved through the branches. Birds came and went, yet the monk did not speak, he did not move, he simply sat in stillness. This monk was Siddhartha, who would soon become the Buddha. At first, people did not understand. They came to ask questions, to offer advice, even to mock him. "Why sit in silence when the world suffers?" some asked. "Why not act? Why not speak?" But he only looked at them with calm eyes, offering no words. As days passed, others began to gather. Some sat nearby, curious. Some stayed longer, sensing something they could not name. There was no chanting, no sermons, no loud declarations. Only the sound of breath, the rustle of leaves, the hum of life around stillness. A young woman approached one morning, carrying food for her sick father. She had heard of the monk under the tree. She asked no questions but sat nearby, just to rest. She stayed for hours without knowing why. That night, she returned home lighter, as if her burdens had grown softer. Others followed. A fisherman, tired of the cruelty of his trade, sat beside the monk and cried quietly for the first time in years. A merchant, weary from greed, simply sat and watched his breath for the first time in his life. None were told what to do, none were corrected, yet many left changed. The silence beneath the Bodhi tree did not answer questions with words. It answered with presence. It reminded people of something they had forgotten, that peace does not come from outside, but from within. That silence, real silence, is not emptiness, but fullness, a fullness that cannot be shouted, only felt. And one night, as the stars shimmered above and the earth lay still, Siddhartha opened his eyes, not to speak, but to see clearly for the first time. Beneath that tree, in perfect silence, he awakened. Moral of the story: true wisdom grows in stillness. When we stop chasing noise and listen to silence, we begin to hear the deepest truths, not with our ears, but with our hearts. The next story is called The Bell That Rang Without a Hand. In a quiet mountain monastery, hidden among pines and mist, there hung an old bronze bell. It was large, heavy, and smooth with age. The monks said it had not been touched in many years. No rope hung from it. No one climbed the tower. Yet, now and then, the bell would ring. No one could explain it. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, when the world was still between night and morning, the bell would sound clear, deep, and soft. It was not loud, but it reached the ears like a memory. It echoed gently through the valley and disappeared into silence. New monks often asked about it. "Who rings the bell?" they would say. The older monks only smiled and replied, "No one, and everyone." One day, a young monk who had only just joined the monastery was troubled. He had come seeking peace, but his thoughts were loud. He judged others. He judged himself. He wanted answers, wanted progress, wanted clarity. He grew frustrated with the silence of the place. "Why do the senior monks never explain?" he asked the abbot. "Why do they tell us nothing about the bell or what it means?" The abbot looked at him kindly and said, "Because the bell does not teach with words, it teaches with presence. It rings when the heart is still enough to hear it." The young monk was confused, but said nothing. That night, unable to sleep, he walked to the bell tower. He stood beside the old bell, looking up at it. The sky was full of stars. The wind was light. He closed his eyes. He listened. And in that quiet moment, the bell rang. He opened his eyes in surprise, but saw no one. Only the bell, still and unmoving. Only the wind, soft through the pines. Only the silence that followed. For the first time, he did not ask why. He did not need to. Something inside him had fallen silent too. And in that silence, he felt peace. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be explained, they can only be experienced. When the mind becomes quiet and open, even a bell with no hand may speak directly to the soul. The next story is called A Single Leaf's Journey. At the edge of a monastery garden, in the golden light of early autumn, a single leaf loosened its hold on a tall tree. It twisted gently in the breeze, soft and slow, and drifted through the air like a silent whisper. It did not resist. It did not hurry. It simply let go. A young monk, sitting nearby, looked up just as the leaf began its fall. He watched its graceful descent, following its every turn. Something about the way it moved touched him deeply, though he didn't yet know why. Later, during the evening meal, the monk turned to his teacher and asked, "Why did watching that leaf make me feel so still, even though I don't understand it?" The teacher smiled and said, "Because in that moment, you weren't thinking, you were witnessing. The leaf reminded you how to let go." The monk sat quietly, taking in those words. In the days that followed, he noticed more leaves falling. Some spun wildly, some floated gently, some clung until the last wind shook them free. He realized none of the leaves fought their fall. They didn't fear the ground. They didn't look back at the branch. They simply let themselves be carried by the wind, completely trusting the journey. The young monk began to reflect on his own life. He saw how tightly he held on to thoughts, fears, and the need to be perfect. He held on to people, memories, and worries about what was next. His heart was full, not with peace, but with clinging, and yet the leaf had fallen so easily. He returned to the garden often, sitting beneath the tree that now stood bare. In the quiet, he began to breathe differently, slower, softer. He didn't force the thoughts away, but he let them come and go, like leaves drifting on the wind. As the seasons changed, so did he. Not with noise or effort, but with silence and surrender. Just like the leaf, he learned to fall without fear, without resistance into the present moment. Moral of the story: peace begins when we let go. Like a leaf that trusts the wind, we find freedom not in holding on, but in surrendering to the flow of life with grace and trust. The next story is called The Candle That Refused to Burn Out. In a quiet temple nestled between two rivers, there was a single candle that had burned for many years. It stood before a statue of the Buddha in the main hall, small, unremarkable, yet always glowing. The monks never replaced it. Rain came, winds howled. Even when all other lights went dark during storms, this one flame remained. Travelers often stopped at the temple to rest. Many noticed the candle and asked, "How can such a tiny flame last so long?" The monks would only bow slightly and say, "It burns with more than wax." One evening, a troubled man arrived. His eyes were tired and his shoulders heavy with grief. He had lost much: his family, his home, his sense of direction. The silence of the temple felt unfamiliar and sharp. That night, unable to sleep, he wandered into the main hall. There he sat before the candle, watching it flicker. Hours passed. He spoke aloud, not expecting an answer, only needing to speak. He spoke of pain, of regret, of feeling empty and lost. The flame did not waver. Then, in a whisper, he asked, "Why are you still burning?" He leaned forward and stared into its quiet glow. He saw how gently it moved, how steadily it held. He noticed that it did not fight the air around it. It danced with it. It did not roar. It did not flicker wildly. It simply stayed, warm, present, alive. A monk entered quietly and sat beside him. After a long silence, he said, "The candle stays lit because it does not try to burn brighter than it needs to. It doesn't rush. It doesn't fear the dark. It simply offers what it is without force, without pride." The man listened, eyes still on the flame. The monk continued, "You are not broken. You are like this candle, still burning, even when you think you've gone out. Your pain is real, but your light has not left you. It is small, perhaps, but steady." The man wept softly, not because he was sad, but because something in him had remembered its own light. Moral of the story: even the smallest light can endure the darkest night. When we stop trying to shine for the world and simply allow ourselves to be, our inner flame reveals its quiet, lasting strength. The next story is called Rain on the Roof of the Temple. The rains came quietly that evening as soft clouds gathered over the hills. At the hilltop temple, the monks were already inside, seated for evening meditation. Outside, the wind carried the first drops onto the tiled rooflight, steady, gentle. The sound was unlike anything else. Not music, not silence, but something between the two. The older monks sat still, their eyes closed, their breath steady. But a young novice could not settle. His thoughts ran wild. He worried about whether he was meditating the right way, whether he belonged there, whether he would ever feel the peace the others seemed to hold so easily. His eyes flicked open again and again. His legs ached. His breath felt tight. The sound of the rain, instead of soothing him, only reminded him of how restless he felt inside. After the meditation bell rang, he approached the old monk who swept the temple steps every morning. The novice asked, "Why does the rain calm others, but not me? I hear it, but it doesn't bring peace." The old monk looked out toward the dark sky and said, "When I was your age, the rain disturbed me too. I tried to block it out, to focus harder. But one night, I gave up trying. I just listened. He smiled gently and added, "The rain does not ask you to be peaceful. It only asks you to hear it. That's enough." That night, the young monk returned to the hall. He sat again in silence. This time, he made no effort to fight the sound or his restless thoughts. He listened. Drop after drop on the temple roof, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. He didn't judge it. He didn't try to turn it into anything else. Slowly, his breath softened. The tension in his chest faded. The thoughts still came, but now they passed through him like clouds, and the rain kept falling. He stayed there long after the others had left, just listening, just being, not peaceful, not perfect, just present. Moral of the story: peace doesn't come by force. Like the sound of rain, it comes when we stop trying to control it. In simply being present, without resistance, we return to stillness. The next story is called The Smile of the Sleeping Monk. In a remote monastery high in the mountains, there lived an elderly monk known for his silence, his calm presence, and his gentle smile. He spoke very little, often spending his days sweeping the temple paths, sitting in meditation, or tending to the small garden behind the prayer hall. Yet what drew people most to him wasn't his wisdom or his word-sit, was the way he smiled, even in his sleep. One night, a younger monk passing by the elder's room paused at the doorway. The old monk lay on a simple mat, eyes closed, face lit by moonlight, and he was smiling, softly, as if the world itself were resting with him. Curious, the young monk asked the abbot the next morning, "Why does he smile, even when he's not awake? What could he be dreaming about?" The abbot smiled too and replied, "He is not smiling at a dream. He is smiling because peace has become his nature." The younger monk didn't understand at first. For him, peace was something he chased through deep meditation, long recitations, and trying hard to still the noise in his mind. But often, his thoughts returned. Doubts returned. The silence felt heavy, not freeing. Over the weeks, he watched the elder monk more closely. He noticed how he never rushed, how he looked at the smallest flower as if it were a sacred scripture, how he spoke to birds and stones and clouds with the same reverence. The older monk didn't fight the world, he welcomed it. One day, as the younger monk swept the garden, he stopped suddenly. A breeze moved through the trees. A single leaf floated down. For the first time, he didn't name the moment. He didn't think about it, he just smiled. That night, as he lay on his mat, he felt something new, not joy, not pride, but a soft quiet inside him. He understood now. Peace was not something to grasp, it was something to become. And before sleep took him, he, too, smiled. Moral of the story: true peace is not found in escaping the world, but in embracing it fully. When the mind is no longer fighting, even sleep becomes a meditation, and the soul remembers how to smile. The next story is called Footsteps Across the Floating Bridge. In a quiet valley where mist clung to the trees each morning, there was a narrow wooden bridge that stretched across a slow, glassy river. This bridge was unlike others. It floated. Supported by hidden beams just below the surface, it shifted gently with every step, rising and falling with the weight of the one walking. Crossing it required balance, stillness, and trust. A young monk was sent across the bridge one morning to gather herbs from the forest on the other side. He had never walked it before. As he stepped onto the planks, they moved beneath him. His heart jumped. The water rippled just inches below. He stopped, frozen. What if he slipped? What if he lost his balance? What if the bridge failed? He took a breath and turned back. "It's too dangerous," he told the elder monk who had sent him. The elder simply nodded. "Then you may try again tomorrow." The next day, the same thing happened, and the next. For a week, the monk stood at the edge of the bridge, afraid. he felt ashamed. He could not explain it, but something inside him resisted the movement, the feeling of not being in control. On the 8th day, something changed. He stepped onto the bridge and felt the wood shift, just as before. But this time, instead of panicking, he paused and listened to the water, to the wind, to the soft creak of the boards. Then he let his breath move with the bridge, his body adjust with its rhythm. Slowly, step by step, he moved forward. Halfway across, he looked down and saw his reflection in the river, unsteady, yes, but still standing. He kept walking. When he reached the other side, the world felt wider somehow, lighter. He returned with the herbs and gave them to the elder without a word. The elder smiled. "You see," he said softly, "the bridge never needed to be still. Only you did." The young monk bowed his head, the sound of his own quiet footsteps still echoing in his mind. Moral of the story: life is always moving beneath us. Peace is not found by waiting for stillness outside, but by discovering balance within. When we stop resisting the shift, we begin to walk with trust. The next story is called The Cat Who Waited for Enlightenment. In a temple shaded by old cherry trees, there lived a quiet cat named Tashi. She belonged to no one, yet everyone cared for her. The monks fed her gently, and visitors often stopped to stroke her soft fur. She wandered the grounds as if she were born there, always moving slowly, as though listening to the wind. What made Tashi special was not her calm presence or her bright golden eye, it was where she liked to sit. Every day, at sunrise and sunset, she would curl up at the base of the Bodhi tree where the monks meditated. She never caused a disturbance. She never chased birds or begged for food. She simply sat. One morning, a young monk noticed her and whispered, half-jokingly, "Tashi, are you waiting for enlightenment too?" The cat blinked slowly and turned her gaze to the rising sun, as if the question itself was enough. The monk smiled but wondered, could a creature that never studied scriptures, never recited sutras, never sat cross-legged in stillness truly understand what it means to awaken? He began to watch her more closely. When it rained, Tashi waited quietly under the eaves, never anxious. When someone stepped too close, she would move gently away without fear or anger. When she ate fully. When she rested fully. There was no rush, no greed, no resistance. She moved through the temple like a cloud, touching everything, needing nothing. One evening, the monk found himself overwhelmed by his thoughts. He had read many teachings, practiced many forms, but still felt distant from peace. He sat by the Bodhi tree, head heavy with doubt. As the sky faded into dusk, Tashi came and sat beside him. She didn't look at him. She didn't purr. She just breathed. The monk closed his eyes. He didn't try to meditate. He didn't reach for a mantra. He just sat, with the cat, with the wind, with the sound of evening settling into the earth. And for a moment, he understood. Not through words, not through effort, but through stillness, through being. Tashi flicked her tail, as if she already knew. Moral of the story: enlightenment does not always arrive through study or striving. Sometimes it comes through presence, patience, and simply being in tune with the world, one breath, one moment at a time. The next story is called Moonlight on Empty Sandals. The night was quiet, and the full moon hung low over the temple courtyard, casting a silver glow over the stone path. Most of the monks had gone to sleep, their robes folded neatly, their sandals lined up in perfect rows outside their doors. But one pair of sandals sat alone beneath the Bodhi tree, dusted with fallen petals and bathed in moonlight. A young monk noticed them as he returned from evening meditation. Curious, he sat nearby and waited. Hours passed. No one came for the sandals. The moon climbed higher. The breeze whispered through the leaves. He wondered who had left them. Had someone gone walking and lost their way? Had a monk left the temple in silence, unnoticed, or were they simply forgotten? The young monk's thoughts swirled like wind through tall grass, questions, stories, worries. But as he sat longer, something in him began to slow. He looked at the sandals again, not as a mystery to solve, but simply as they were, quiet, still, untouched. He began to notice the beauty in their emptiness, the way the moonlight fell gently over them, the space they held, the presence of absence. In that moment, he felt something unexpected: stillness, not just around him, but inside him. He wasn't reaching, wasn't trying to understand. He was simply there, like the sandals, resting in the quiet. Suddenly, he remembered something his teacher once said during morning tea. Sometimes presence is loud, and sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it wears robes and chants, and sometimes it is a pair of sandals left beneath the moon. The monk smiled, the wind brushing his sleeve. He did not know who had left the sandals or why, but he no longer needed to know. The peace of the moment was enough. When he finally stood to return to his room, he bowed to the sandals, not out of ritual, but out of gratitude. They had become his teacher tonight. Moral of the story: stillness is not always found in answers. Sometimes it comes through simply noticing, allowing, and being present. In emptiness, there is beauty. In silence, there is deep wisdom. The next story is called The Whispering Tea Kettle. In a small mountain temple where the mist moved slowly through pine branches, there was an old kitchen that always smelled of warm herbs and quiet mornings. In the center of this kitchen sat a weathered iron tea kettle. Its surface was darkened by years of fire, and its handle had been wrapped in cloth by hands long forgotten. Though simple in shape, this kettle was treated with deep care, cleaned gently, placed on the stove with intention, and never rushed. What made this kettle special was its whisper. When the water began to boil, it did not scream or whistle loudly like newer ones. Instead, it let out a soft, steady humor breath, more than a sound. It was so subtle that you had to be very still to notice it. Many monks never paid it much attention, but one monk, an older woman named Annie, listened closely every morning. While others hurried through chores or morning chants, Annie would sit by the kettle, waiting for that first whisper. She brewed the tea slowly, silently, breathing in the warmth of the moment. When asked why, she only said, "The kettle teaches me how to listen." One winter day, a young monk came into the kitchen, upset after meditation. His thoughts had been loud, his knees ached, he couldn't focus, he felt like a failure. He dropped his bowl a little too hard on the counter and sighed loudly. Annie, sitting by the stove, looked up at him and smiled. "Come sit," she said softly. "Listen to the kettle." He hesitated but sat down. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside the window. Slowly, the soft hum of the kettle began, barely a sound, more like a breath between words. The young monk listened. His shoulders softened. His thoughts quieted, not because he forced them to stop, but because something gentler entered the room. After a while, Annie poured them both tea. She did not offer advice or correction. She only passed him the cup and said, "Peace doesn't shout. It whispers, just like the kettle. And when we're quiet enough, it teaches us how to hear again." Moral of the story: stillness speaks in soft ways. When we slow down and truly listen, even an old kettle can become a teacher of peace, presence, and the quiet healing of now. The next story is called Clouds That Bow to the Mountain. High in the mountains, where the wind sings through pine trees and time seems to move slowly, a young monk sat on a flat stone ledge overlooking the vast valley below. He had been sent there by his teacher to meditate, alone, from sunrise to sunset. He was told not to move, not to write, not to seek answers, only to sit and observe. At first, the monk found it difficult. His legs ached. His thoughts pulled him back to the temple, to his chores, to his longing for progress. He watched the sun rise but did not feel peace. He counted the clouds but found no meaning in them. By midday, frustration filled his chest. What am I supposed to learn from just sitting here, he thought. I want wisdom, not emptiness. Just then, a great cloud drifted into view, slow and wide like a sail. It moved gently across the sky, softening the sun's light. As the cloud reached the peak of the tallest mountain before him, something caught his eye. The cloud curved, bowed low, and wrapped itself around the mountain's face. It did not rush past. It stayed. It embraced the mountain with grace, and for a moment, the world seemed to breathe. The monk stared at this silent meeting. No words, no sound, just the soft presence of cloud and mountain, one yielding, the other unmoving, one flowing, the other firm. And yet there was no conflict, only harmony. His breath deepened, his thoughts quieted. He suddenly understood the cloud did not force its way through the mountain. It did not fight. It bowed not out of weakness, but out of respect. Out of knowing that stillness has its own kind of power. The monk sat for hours more, not waiting for anything now, simply witnessing. The clouds continued their slow journey, each one offering a lesson in softness, surrender, and grace. The mountain did nothing, and yet it taught the most. By the time the sun began to fall, the monk no longer felt restless. The silence around him matched the quiet within. He bowed to the mountain before rising. Moral of the story: true wisdom knows when to be still and when to yield. Like clouds that bow to the mountain, peace comes not from force, but from gentle surrender and quiet respect for what is. The next story is called A Rock That Dreamed of Flying. At the base of a great mountain, where moss grew thick and the sun rarely reached, there lay a small round rock. It had been there for centuries through storms, seasons, and silence. No one noticed it. Travelers stepped over it. Animals walked around it. Even the wind seemed to pass it by. But the rock had a secret. It dreamed of flying. Though it had never moved on its own, never felt the sky or touched the clouds, the rock often imagined what it would be like to soar. At night, as the stars blinked above, it pictured itself rising into the sky weightless, free, floating beyond the trees, above the mountains, into the endless blue. One morning, a young monk came to meditate near the rock. He sat beneath a tree, eyes closed, mind heavy with doubt. He had been struggling, feeling stuck in his practice, burdened by the feeling that others were rising while he remained grounded. His thoughts told him he wasn't enough, that he was too still, too slow, too ordinary. As the monk opened his eyes, he noticed the small rock by his feet. For some reason, he reached down and held it in his hands. It was cool, solid, unmoving. He stared at it for a long while. Then, gently, he placed it on a nearby ledge, just a little higher than before. Each day, he returned. Each day, he moved the rock a little further up the path. Never far, just enough. Seasons passed. Snow fell, melted, and flowers bloomed again. The monk, still unsure why he continued, carried the rock slowly, steadily toward the mountain's peak. It became a quiet ritual, something between prayer and friendship. The rock said nothing, yet the monk began to feel a peace he hadn't known before. Finally, after many months, he reached the summit. The sky was wide and open, the wind was strong. The monk placed the rock on a flat surface and stepped back. The rock did not fly. But in that moment, the monk understood. It didn't need to. It had made the journey. And sometimes, rising isn't about leaving the ground, it's about being carried by intention, step by patient step. Moral of the story: not all dreams come true in the way we imagine. Sometimes, just the journey toward them lifts us higher than we ever thought possible. Even the heaviest soul can rise when moved with care, presence, and quiet purpose. The next story is called The Monastery Without Walls. Far beyond the reach of city noise and winding roads, nestled between meadows and ancient trees, there was once a monastery known not for its structure, but for its absence of one. It had no stone walls, no gates, and no boundary lines. The wind passed through it freely, birds flew through the prayer grounds. Travelers often passed by without even knowing they had walked through sacred space. Yet monks lived there quietly, peacefully, purposefully. A wandering seeker arrived one morning, confused. He had been told by villagers of a famous monastery hidden in the hills. But when he arrived, all he found were a few wooden huts, a small garden, and monks sitting under trees. There was no temple bell, no grand archway, no towering gate. Frustrated, he asked an elderly monk, "Where is the monastery?" The monk looked up from sweeping the earth and replied, "You are standing in it." The seeker frowned. "But where are the walls? Where is the sacred space?" The old monk smiled. "Sacredness is not in stone, it is in stillness. The monastery begins where the heart becomes quiet." The seeker sat down, unsure what to make of the answer. As the day passed, he watched. Monks moved with calm steps, tending to the garden, fetching water, meditating beneath the open sky. There were no schedules shouted aloud, no chants echoing through halls, yet everything flowed in harmony. By evening, the seeker noticed how the sunset turned the garden golden, how the wind touched the trees with care, how every action of the monks felt both simple and complete. There was no boundary, and yet nothing was chaotic. He felt something shift within himself, something unforced, unspoken. He understood, quietly, that the monastery without walls was not a place to enter. It was a way of being, a space created not by brick and wood, but by presence, humility, and awareness. He stayed there for many days. But even when he left, walking back through the forest path, he carried the monastery with him within his breath, his footsteps, his silence. Moral of the story: peace does not live in buildings or borders. It lives where the heart becomes still. When we carry awareness in each step, every place becomes sacred, and we discover that the truest temple has no walls at all. The next story is called The Sparrow and the Silent Monk. In a quiet forest temple surrounded by tall cedar trees, there lived a monk who had taken a vow of silence. He had not spoken a word in many years, choosing instead to live in stillness, observing the world with open eyes and a peaceful heart. He swept the temple grounds each morning, gathered fallen leaves, lit incense, and meditated beneath the trees, saying nothing, needing nothing. Most people passed him by with respect, though some thought him strange. "How can he teach anything if he never speaks?" they would ask. But the monk never answered, and those who spent time near him often felt something soften inside something they couldn't explain. One day, as he meditated beneath a wide tree at the edge of the temple garden, a small sparrow landed nearby. Its wing was bent-injured from a fall, or perhaps a hungry hawk. It hopped slowly in the grass, chirping softly, trying to lift itself but failing again and again. The monk opened his eyes and watched. He didn't rush forward. He didn't speak. He simply sat, breathing gently, with deep presence. The sparrow paused, looking up at him. Then, strangely, it stopped trying to fly. It sat near him, resting, as if the stillness surrounding the monk was something it could feel. Hours passed. The monk slowly stood, walked into the garden, and returned with a small bowl of water and a few grains of rice. He placed them gently near the sparrow, then returned to his seat. Over the next few days, the sparrow came each morning and stayed by the monk's side. It no longer fluttered in panic. It did not fear. It simply existed in the quiet space they shared. Eventually, its wing healed, and on a morning filled with soft sun and warm air, the sparrow flew again. It circled the tree once, twice, then landed for a final moment on the monk's shoulder. The monk smiled, just slightly, but said nothing. And then the sparrow was gone, carried by the wind. Many monks saw this. They later said it was the monk's silence that had healed the bird. But the monk, as always, offered no words, only presence. Moral of the story: true healing doesn't always come from words or actions. Sometimes, quiet presence and gentle attention are enough to mend what's broken. In silence, we create space for others to rest, to breathe, and to find their own way back to flight. The next story is called The Lantern That Listened. In a remote village nestled among tall cedar trees, there stood a small, humble temple known for one thing: a single lantern that burned softly at its entrance, day and night. It was not bright or grand. Its flame was steady, quiet, and warm. Villagers believed that the lantern had been lit by a wise monk many years ago, monk who said nothing, taught no formal sermons, and yet helped many find peace. People called it the lantern that listened. Whenever someone felt lost, angry, or heartbroken, they would come and sit by the lantern. They would speak aloud, or sometimes say nothing at all. They would sit in silence, the flickering light gently warming their faces. The lantern gave no answers. It never moved. It simply burned. One evening, a young man arrived from the city. He had heard stories of the lantern and hoped to find clarity for the pain he carried. His heart was heavy from betrayal, his thoughts filled with confusion and grief. He sat before the lantern and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The flame continued to sway softly, casting long shadows along the temple walls. The young man grew frustrated. "This is foolish," he said out loud. "It's just a lantern. It's not going to help me. It's not even alive." An old monk sweeping nearby paused and looked toward him. "The lantern listens," he said gently, "because it does not try to fix. It does not judge. It holds space." The young man stared at the flame. He had spent so long trying to be heard, trying to explain his pain, trying to be understood. But here, in the presence of something that made no demands, he finally felt safe enough to cry. Not loudly, not for attention, just softly, like a long exhale after holding one's breath too long. That night, he stayed until the stars blinked above the temple. He didn't need to be told what to do. He didn't find answers. But something in him grew quieter, lighter. The lantern never flickered out, and it never spoke, but many left feeling heard. Moral of the story: sometimes the deepest healing comes not from being answered, but from being held in silence. When we listen without judgment, like the steady flame of a lantern, we offer peace without a single word. The next story is called Snowflakes on the Master's Sleeve. Snow fell gently over the mountain monastery, covering the rooftops, the trees, and the winding paths in a blanket of quiet white. The world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the meditation hall, the fire burned low, and the monks sat in stillness, their breaths rising like mist. A young monk, new to the order, had been struggling through the winter. His mind was restless. He longed for answers. He wanted to feel peace, but couldn't quiet the thoughts that filled his head: worries about his past, doubts about his path, questions with no clear end. The cold only made it worse. Everything felt distant and heavy. One morning, before the sun had risen, he went to speak to the master, who always rose early to sweep the temple steps. The snow was still falling, soft as breath. The master, wrapped in his robe, swept slowly, each movement full of care. His sleeves were long and loose, and as the snow fell, tiny flakes began to gather on the fabric, resting there for just a moment before melting into the cloth. The young monk stood nearby, watching silently. Then he asked, "Master, How can I stop these thoughts? They keep coming, like the snow. I try to push them away, but they always return. The master did not stop sweeping. He looked at the boy with kind eyes, then lifted his sleeve slightly. "See these snowflakes?" he said softly. "They land on my sleeve, and I do not try to catch them. I do not brush them off. I simply let them land, and then," he paused, "they melt on their own." The monk looked closer. The snowflakes did not stay long. They arrived, they rested, and then they disappeared. There was no struggle, no resistance. The master smiled gently and continued sweeping. The young monk said nothing more. He stood there, letting the snow fall on his own robe. He didn't fight it this time. He didn't try to chase peace. Instead, he stood quietly and watched the snow thoughts still coming, but no longer needing to be controlled. For the first time, he felt the calm beneath them. Moral of the story: like snowflakes on a sleeve, thoughts come and go. When we stop grasping and resisting, they melt gently away. Peace isn't found in pushing thoughts aside. It's found in letting them pass with patience and stillness. The next story is called The River That Forgot to Flow. In a distant valley surrounded by ancient hills, there once lived a river that had always flowed freely, soft and steady, weaving through meadows, nourishing trees, and singing its quiet song to all who listened. People from nearby villages would come to its banks to pray, to rest, to feel peace in its gentle movement. But one summer, without warning, the river stopped. Its waters no longer ran. The surface lay still and silent, like glass. Birds no longer came. The grasses began to wilt. The villagers grew afraid. Some blamed the sky for giving no rain. Others feared it was a sign that something sacred had been broken. A monk who had lived beside the river for many years sat quietly by its edge. He placed his hand on the cool, unmoving water and simply watched. Days passed, and he remained there unworried, listening. A child from the village approached him one evening and asked, "Why won't the river flow? Can't you help it?" The monk smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes even rivers forget who they are. They grow still, not to disappear, but to remember." The child tilted her head. "Remember what?" "That movement is not always the way forward," he said. "Even a river must rest." The child sat beside him, puzzled but comforted by his calmness. As the days continued, the sky finally opened. A quiet rain fell, not heavy, not rushed. Drop by drop, the water welcomed the sky again. Slowly, the river began to stir. It did not rush to be fast. It did not try to prove anything. It simply flowed, soft, gentle, sure, as if it had always known it would. The monk watched without surprise. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Even stillness has its purpose." The villagers rejoiced, but the monk only smiled. He knew the river had never been broken. It had only paused to listen to the earth, to itself, to the silence beneath its usual song. Moral of the story: even when we feel stuck or silent inside, it does not mean we are lost. Stillness is not failure. It is a part of the journey. Like the river that pauses, we too may stop, not to give up, but to gently remember how to flow again. The next story is called 5 Breaths to Stillness. The temple bell rang softly in the early morning light, echoing through the valley like a gentle invitation. Monks moved silently through the mist, beginning their day with quiet rituals. But one young monk, named Kian, sat alone near the lotus pond, his heart racing beneath his robe. His thoughts were tangled, his breath shallow. No matter how long he meditated, he felt no peace. He had been in the monastery for nearly a year, and though he followed every instruction, he often felt like he was failing. His thoughts wandered, his body ached, his mind shouted even in the deepest silence. That morning, the old master came and sat beside him without a word. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the slow ripple of water and the wind moving through reeds. Then the master turned to him and asked, "How many breaths have you taken this morning?" Kian was surprised. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. "I don't know, master. Hundreds, I suppose." The master smiled gently. "Yes. But how many have you truly lived?" Kian looked down, his chest rising quickly with his anxious breath. The master reached into his robe and drew out a small stone. He placed it in Kian's hand and said, "Let us breathe 5 times, nothing more, but each breath you must feel from beginning to end. No future, no past, just this breath, as if it's the only one you'll ever have." They sat together in silence. 1 breath, in, slow and deep, out, steady like a tide. 2 breaths. The world began to soften around the edges. 3 breaths. His shoulders lowered without him trying. 4 breaths. No thoughts, only the sound of wind and water. 5 breaths. A strange lightness, a deep stillness. Tears welled in Kian's eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of being, at last, fully here. Not chasing, not running, just sitting, just breathing. The master placed a hand on his shoulder. "You do not need a lifetime to find peace," he said. "You only need this breath, and then the next." Moral of the story: peace is never fair. It lives in the breath we are taking right now. When we give our full attention to just a few breaths, we return to ourselves and discover that stillness has always been waiting within. The next story is called The Ox That Watched the Sunset. In the wide, open fields beyond a quiet village, an old ox stood at the edge of the grass, gazing toward the horizon as the sun dipped low behind the hills. He had worked the land for many years, pulling carts, turning soil, carrying heavy loads through all seasons. His back was strong but worn. His steps were slow but steady. Now, in the fading light, there was no plow behind him, no farmer calling his name. There was only the wind brushing the grass and the warmth of the sun touching his face as it fell into evening. From a nearby temple, a young monk saw the ox standing still and became curious. Each evening, the ox returned to the same spot, doing nothing, just watching, as if waiting for something. One day, the monk followed and sat nearby, silent, watching too. He waited for the ox to move, to wander, to eat. But the ox stood, calm and unmoving, his eyes fixed on the horizon. As the sky turned gold and then soft pink, the monk felt a strange peace fill his chest. The next day, the monk asked his teacher, "Why does the ox just stand there watching the sun? He does nothing. He simply stares." The teacher looked out at the evening sky and said softly, "Because after years of pulling and pushing, he has learned there is nothing left to chase. Now, he simply is. He watches because he can. He rests not in body alone, but in spirit." The monk didn't fully understand, but he began to return each evening to sit with the ox. Day by day, his thoughts grew quieter. He no longer needed answers. He no longer felt rushed. In the ox's stillness, he found a strange kind of wisdom, slow, wordless, and whole. The ox never spoke, never moved quickly, never tried to teach, but in his silent watching, he became a mirror. And the monk, without realizing, was learning how to stop running, how to be fully present, and how to welcome the beauty of a single passing moment. Moral of the story: peace is not found in endless doing. It arises when we stop chasing and start witnessing. Like the ox watching the sunset, true rest begins when we learn to simply be, with no need to arrive anywhere else. The next story is called A Mirror in the Bamboo Grove. Hidden within the hills, where the mist clung to the trees and the air smelled of earth and rain, lay a bamboo grove surrounding a small, weathered temple. Few visitors came there, and the monks who lived among the swaying stalks spoke little. The grove itself felt sacred. the kind of place where even the wind moved with reverence. One morning, after days of quiet rain, a young monk wandered into the heart of the grove with questions heavy in his chest. He had been struggling with anger sharp and sudden, rising without warning. Though he meditated and followed his teacher's words, the anger would return, like a fire he could not put out. He sat beside a narrow path where the bamboo grew thickest. As he lowered himself to the ground, something caught his eye, a square object resting at the base of a fallen stalk. It was a mirror-old, wooden-framed, speckled with age, yet still clear. He picked it up carefully, unsure who had left it there. As he looked into it, he saw his own face troubled, tired, and uncertain. He stared for a long time, not moving, as the bamboo swayed above him. Later that day, he brought the mirror to the master and asked, "Why would someone leave a mirror in the grove?" The master took the mirror in his hands, turned it once, then gave it back. "Perhaps," he said gently, "they wanted the grove to teach a different kind of lesson." The monk waited. The master continued, "The bamboo bends without breaking. It moves with the wind and never resists the rain. But the mirror, it reflects only what is. When you look into it, it doesn't argue. It doesn't flatter. It shows you your face, exactly as it is." The monk's eyes dropped. "But I don't like what I see." The master nodded. "That's where the teaching begins. The mirror isn't there to shame you. It's there to show you the truth without judgment. Your anger, your fear, they are part of your reflection. But reflections change. When you meet yourself honestly, without turning away, you begin to soften, like bamboo, like wind." That evening, the monk returned the mirror to the grove, not to hide it, but to let it remain. A quiet teacher beneath the green, waiting for the next seeker to sit and see. Moral of the story: the first step to peace is seeing ourselves clearly. When we face our reflection with honesty and compassion, we begin to change not by force, but by gentle acceptance. Like bamboo, we bend, and in that bending we begin to heal. The next story is called The Gate That Never Closed. On the edge of a forest where tall trees whispered with wind and time moved slowly, there stood a small wooden gate. It marked the entrance to an old monastery, quiet and simple, tucked between stones and trees. Unlike other gates, this one had no lock. It never creaked shut. Through every season storm, sun or snow, the gate remained open. Travelers noticed it right away. Some felt welcomed, others confused. A few grew suspicious. One day, a scholar from a distant province arrived at the monastery. After walking many days, he stood before the open gate and frowned. "Is this not careless?" he asked a passing monk. "Without closing it, anyone could enter, animals, thieves, or worse." The monk paused, smiling gently. "Yes, anyone may enter. That is why it remains open." The scholar, puzzled, followed him inside. He spent several days at the monastery, watching how people came and went, farmers bringing offerings, children chasing butterflies through the gardens, strangers sitting to rest under trees. No one was turned away. No one asked for permission. Still, he could not let go of his question. He returned to the gate each evening, staring at it, waiting for someone to misuse it, to push past without care. But all who entered seemed to soften once they passed through. Their voices lowered, their steps slowed. Finally, he approached the abbot and asked, "Why not close it, just at night? Don't you worry about danger?" The abbot folded his hands and said, "Some gates are meant to protect, others are meant to welcome. This one was never built for fear, it was built for trust." The scholar fell silent. He had spent much of his life guarding his own heart, like a fortress, questioning others, closing off, retreating. But here, in this place with no walls and an open gate, he felt something inside begin to loosen. That night, As the stars emerged and the wind rustled the trees, he sat beside the gate. He didn't watch it. He didn't guard it. He simply let it be. And for the first time in many years, so did his heart. Moral of the story: when we live in fear, we close ourselves to life. But trust opens the gate to peace. The heart, like a true monastery, welcomes more light when it chooses to remain open, even when it's easier to shut. The next story is called The Wind's Forgotten Name. In the dry hills beyond the village, where the earth cracked under the sun and the trees stood twisted by time, the wind always blew. It rushed through empty fields, slipped through temple doors, and whispered secrets no one remembered. The villagers called it many things: the traveler, the singer, the restless one, but no one knew its true name. In truth, the wind had forgotten it too. Long ago, the wind had a name given by the sky itself, but over centuries of rushing, changing, and wandering, it let go of who it was. It no longer asked where it was going or why it moved. It simply went on, stirring dust, shaking windows, and brushing cheeks without knowing who it was. One morning, in a quiet temple nestled among rocks and silence, a monk sat beneath a crumbling archway. He had been there for many years, growing older in the company of stillness. He had no ambition, no desire for recognition. He had only one practitioner listening. That day, the wind arrived in a flurry of dry leaves, swirling around the temple like a child forgotten by time. It howled against the stones and rattled the prayer flags until they flapped wildly in protest. But the monk did not move. He did not flinch. He sat with his eyes closed, a small smile softening his face. The wind, curious, circled him again and again. "Why do you not fear me?" it asked, though its voice was more breath than word. The monk opened his eyes, looked up into the shifting sky, and said, "Because I know you are searching." "For what?" the wind asked. The monk touched his chest lightly. "Yourself." The wind paused. It moved slowly now, quieter. The monk continued, "You race through the world, trying to be everything at once, loud, fast, strong. But what you long for is not out there. It is here, in stillness." The wind grew softer, like a sigh. It wrapped itself gently around the monk, like an old friend coming home. In that moment, it remembered how it once felt to be known not by what it could stir or destroy, but by the silence it left behind. It did not remember its name, but it no longer needed one. Moral of the story: we often forget who we are by trying to become everything at once. In stillness, we don't need to be named, understood, or praised. We only need to return to ourselves, quietly and completely. The next story is called The Cherry Blossom That Slept In. Spring arrived early in the village. The trees awakened with pink and white blossoms, lining the roads and filling the air with gentle fragrance. Each morning, petals floated down like soft snow, and villagers paused to admire the beauty that lasted only for a short while. All the trees bloomed except one. At the edge of the monastery garden, there was a cherry blossom tree that remained bare. Day after day, it stood silent and still, its branches reaching into the sky with no signs of color. Visitors whispered about it. Is it sick? Did it die over the winter? Why hasn't it bloomed? A young monk noticed the murmurs and grew uneasy. He began watching the tree each morning, silently willing it to catch up. He thought, it must bloom soon. It must not be left behind. One evening, after meditation, he approached the old gardener who tended the temple grounds and asked, "Should we do something for the tree? Feed it, prune it, help it bloom faster?" The gardener simply smiled and said, "No, she is not late. She is just not rushed." The monk frowned. "But all the others have already bloomed." "Yes," the gardener said gently, "but she is not the others." The monk fell quiet. Days passed, and still the tree showed no sign of blooming. The monk tried to let go of his worry, but part of him still checked each morning, looking for a single bud, a hint of pink. Then, one quiet morning, after a soft rain, he stepped into the garden and stopped. The tree once still and bare was covered in blossoms. But these blossoms were not like the others. They were deeper in color, almost glowing in the morning light, and the scent was richer, fuller. The monk stood in silence, heart swelling not with relief, but with awe. He finally understood. The tree had not slept in. It had simply taken its time, and in that stillness it had gathered something different, something not hurried, something whole. Moral of the story: not all growth happens on the same schedule. Beauty unfolds in its own time. When we stop comparing, we begin to trust our own rhythm, like the blossom that waited. We bloom when we are ready, not when we are expected. The next story is called Crickets Beneath the Full Moon. The summer night was warm and still. The full moon hung like a glowing lantern over the monastery garden, casting silver light over the stones, the trees, and the still pond at its center. Most of the monks had already gone to sleep, their lamps blown out, their rooms silent. But one young monk remained awake, sitting beneath the plum tree near the edge of the garden, heart restless and heavy. He had been struggling in silence for weeks, tired of the quiet, tired of the repetition, tired of the emptiness he couldn't explain. Meditation felt hollow. Chants left his mouth without meaning. He longed for something real, something to touch his soul, but nothing came. He felt more alone than ever, even surrounded by peace. He looked up at the moon and sighed. "Is anyone listening?" he whispered, unsure if he meant the Buddha, the sky, or simply the night. Then he heard them, soft, steady, and small, crickets. Their chirping wasn't loud, but now that he noticed, it filled the garden completely. It wasn't a single sound, but many, woven together like threads of a quiet song. He had heard them before, but never like this. Tonight, they didn't feel like background noise. They felt alive, as if the world was speaking in a language he had forgotten. He closed his eyes. Cricket after cricket, call after call, rose and fell beneath the light of the moon. It was not music, it was not silence, it was something in between. The monk breathed in slowly, then out. For the first time in weeks, his body softened. His thoughts grew quiet. He did not find a sudden answer, nor did his questions vanish. But something in the sound of those tiny voices reminded him, the world is always here, always whispering, even when we stop listening. The moon stayed still. The pond did not move. But inside him, something shifted. The crickets continued their song, not to be heard, not to be praised, but simply because the night was theirs to sing. Moral of the story: peace doesn't always come in grand answers or sudden clarity. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest sounds, reminding us that even in silence, we are never truly alone. The next story is called The Cup That Poured Peace. In a quiet mountain village, there lived an old monk who was known not for his sermons or writings, but for the way he served tea. People would travel from far away, not to ask questions or seek guidance, but simply to sit at his table and receive a small, handmade clay cup filled with warm tea. He never rushed. He poured slowly, holding the pot with both hands, eyes lowered, movements soft as falling leaves. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were few. Still, those who came to him often left lighter, as though they had been given more than just a drink. One day, a wealthy scholar visited the monk. Proud and full of knowledge, the man spoke at length about his achievements, his readings, and his deep understanding of the Dharma. The monk listened patiently, nodding without interrupting. When the scholar finally paused, the monk smiled gently and reached for the teapot. He began to pour. The cup filled, but the monk did not stop. Tea spilled over the rim, running across the table, dripping to the floor. The scholar quickly leaned forward. "Stop! Can't you see the cup is full?" The monk looked up, calm and steady. "Yes," he said, "just like your mind." The room grew quiet. The scholar opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. The monk continued, softer now. "You came for peace, but your cup is already full with opinions, fears, and expectations. How can peace enter if there is no space?" The scholar sat back, humbled. For the first time in many years, he said nothing. He simply looked at the overflowing tea, and then at the empty space within himself he had never noticed. The monk gently handed him a fresh, empty cup, and this time, when he poured, the scholar watched every drop with new eyes. Moral of the story: peace cannot be poured into a full cup. To receive stillness, we must first let go. When we empty ourselves of noise and pride, we create space for clarity, kindness, and calm to gently fill us. The next story is called A Shoeless Walk at Dawn. The sky was still dark when the young monk stepped out of the temple gate. The world was hushed, waiting for the first breath of morning. Without thinking, he had left his shoes behind. The earth was cool beneath his feet, damp with dew, soft with soil, and scattered with fallen leaves. Each step awakened a sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know why he had walked out. His sleep had been restless, his dreams filled with noise and confusion. Doubts had crept into his heart, whispering that he was not strong enough, not wise enough, not peaceful enough to walk the path he had chosen. The silence of the temple had only made the thoughts louder. But now, with the wind gently brushing his robe and the first hints of light touching the edge of the sky, he walked. No destination, no purpose, just walking. As his bare feet moved across the earth, he noticed everything. The way the ground gave slightly with each step, the scent of pine in the air, the flutter of wings high above. A single spiderweb stretched between two branches, glistening with tiny droplets of silver. He walked past the old plum tree that had lost its flowers, its branches bare but proud. He passed the empty rice field, waiting patiently for the next season. Everything was so still, yet full of quiet life. It was as if the whole world was meditating with him. Each step brought him back to his body, to this moment, to the truth that had no need for words. I am here. He thought of nothing. He remembered nothing. He carried nothing. When he finally returned to the temple, the sun had begun to rise. Light poured over the stone path, and the temple bell rang out once to greet the morning. The young monk looked down at his feet, dusty, wet, and real, and he smiled. Not because his doubts had vanished, but because he had remembered something deeper than thought. That stillness does not require answers. It only asks us to arrive. Moral of the story: sometimes the path to peace is not found through seeking, but through simple presence. When we return to the ground beneath us and walk without expectation, even bare feet can carry us home. The next story is called A Rope Made of Shadows. In a deep forest monastery, far from the reach of cities and noise, there was a narrow path that led through dense trees to a quiet cave. Few monks ventured there alone, especially at night, for the forest was old and its silence was heavy. Strange stories were whispered among novices about things unseen, about fear that walked with no sound. One evening, a young monk was sent to the cave to retrieve an old scroll left by his teacher. The sun was setting as he entered the forest. The path grew darker with every step, and the trees closed in like tall, unmoving statues. He kept his eyes forward, but soon the silence became too loud. Every crunch of his feet, every breath, seemed sharp in the stillness. As the light faded, he saw something stretched across the path ahead, a long, coiled shape. His heart raced. He stopped cold. A snake? Fear gripped him. His mind spun. He had no light, no stick, no guide. He stepped back, his breath uneven, unable to move forward. The forest, already dark, now seemed to watch him. He stood there for a long time, unsure, frozen by what might lie in front of him. Eventually, an older monk, returning from the river, came upon him. "Why have you stopped?" he asked gently. "There's a snake on the path," the young monk whispered. The older monk stepped forward calmly. He knelt down, examined the object, and then chuckled softly. "It's not a snake," he said. "It's just a rope made of shadows." He lifted the old frayed rope with both hands. The trees above had cast lines of shadow across it, twisting it into something fearsome in the monk's mind. "Your fear gave it shape," the elder said, "but it was never what you believed." The young monk stared at the rope in silence, his chest still tight. But inside, something cracked open, not from shame, but from relief. The danger had never been real. Only his mind had made it so. He thanked the elder and walked forward, more slowly now, more aware. Moral of the story: fear often comes from the shadows of our own mind. When we pause and look closely, we find that many of the things we fear are not real threats but ropes mistaken for snakes, made only of thought and darkness. The next story is called The Monk Who Slept Under Stars. Long ago, in the hills where wildflowers bloomed even through the cracks of stone, there lived a wandering monk who never stayed in one place for long. He had no home, no roof, and no walls around him, only the sky above and the earth below. He slept where the wind guided him, beside rivers, beneath trees, and most often beneath the open stars. People in the nearby villages would often offer him shelter. They built temples and huts and soft beds, but he always bowed in gratitude and gently refused. "The stars," he would say with a smile, "remind me of things walls cannot." Many didn't understand. Some thought he was lonely, or perhaps strange. But the monk was never troubled. He walked slowly, spoke softly, and listened deeply. He was known to stop in the middle of a journey just to admire a single flower or the shape of a cloud. Wherever he was completely there. One evening, a young boy followed him out of the village. The boy had heard stories of the monk and his nights beneath the stars. Curious, he asked, "Why do you sleep outside when there are warm rooms and strong roofs?" The monk looked up at the sky, where twilight had begun to settle and the first stars blinked into view. "I sleep under the stars," he said, "because they remind me how small I am and how whole I am too. When the mind grows heavy with worry or longing, the sky helps me let go. It holds everything, and it asks for nothing." They sat together in silence as more stars appeared, quiet as breath. The boy lay back on the grass, and for the first time in his life, he saw the sky not just as background, but as a vast and living thing. The monk said nothing more. He simply rested, as he always did, under the open heavens, his heart steady, his body light, the stars above like gentle eyes watching over him. The boy returned to the village before dawn, but he never forgot that night. Moral of the story: true peace needs no walls. When we allow ourselves to rest in the vastness of the present moment, we remember that we are not lost. We are part of something endless, quiet, and whole. The next story is called The Fish That Refused the Hook. In the clear waters of a wide, still lake beside a small monastery, there lived a quiet silver fish. Unlike the others, it swam alone, slow and graceful, often near the surface, where the sky met the water. Many fishermen came to the lake, casting their lines and dropping bait, hoping to catch something large and strong. But no one ever caught the silver fish. Fishermen grew curious. "It must be clever," they said, "or perhaps lucky." Some tried new bait. Some waited for hours. Still, the fish never took the hook. One day, a young monk sat at the lake's edge after morning meditation. He had heard stories about the fish and wanted to see it for himself. He didn't bring a rod. He simply sat, still and quiet, legs folded beneath him, eyes watching the ripples. The fish appeared, gliding gently through the shallows, its scales shimmering in the morning light. The monk smiled. He whispered, not to catch, but to ask, "Why do you never take the bait?" Of course, the fish didn't speak. But in that moment of stillness, a thought arose in the monk's heart as clear as the water itself. Because not every offering is nourishment, not everything that shines is meant for me. The monk sat in silence as the meaning deepened. He thought of his own mind, how often it had been hooked by praise, pulled by anger, baited by fear, dragged by desire. He remembered how many times he had chased what glittered, only to feel trapped afterward. He understood now. The silverfish was not clever, it was simply aware of what to accept and what to leave untouched. That morning, the monk made a quiet vow not to live avoiding life, but to stop mistaking the bait for the blessing, to look deeply before reacting, to swim in stillness, not out of fear, but out of knowing. The fish disappeared into the deeper water, and the monk rose, carrying no catch, only a deeper peace. Moral of the story: wisdom is knowing when not to bite. The world offers many hooks disguised as gifts. When we learn to pause, to see clearly, we free ourselves from the traps of desire and remain rooted in calm and choice. The next story is called Echoes in the Empty Bell. In the center of a crumbling stone courtyard stood a great bronze bell. Once, it had been the heart of the monastery, rung at dawn to wake the monks, at dusk to guide them into meditation, and in times of sorrow to comfort those in grief. But the bell hadn't been struck in many years. The rope had worn away, and no one had replaced it. Moss had begun to creep along its base. Birds nested above it. Most had forgotten it was even there. A young monk named Soren often walked past the bell on his way to sweep the garden. Each time, he paused and stared at it. Something about its silence pulled at him like a voice that wanted to speak, but no longer remembered how. One morning, Soren approached the bell and placed his hand gently on its side. It was cool and solid beneath his palm. He leaned closer, almost expecting to hear something inside, but there was nothing, only stillness. Later that day, he went to the old master and asked, "Why do we no longer ring the bell?" The master looked out toward the courtyard and said, "It rings, still, but only to those who listen." Soren was puzzled. "But it makes no sound." The master replied, "Not all echoes are made of noise. Some are heard with the heart." That night, when the moon was full and the monastery lay quiet, Soren returned to the courtyard. He stood before the bell and closed his eyes. He did not strike it. He did not move. He simply stood, breathing softly, listening not for a sound, but for a feeling. And slowly, something stirred inside him, not from the bell but from within himself. A memory of his mother's voice, the hush of wind through trees, a time when he felt safe, seen, and still. These were his echoes, not lost, only waiting. Tears filled his eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. He bowed to the bell not because it had spoken, but because he had finally learned how to listen. Moral of the story: some silence carries more than sound. When we listen not with our ears but with our hearts, we hear the echoes of everything we've forgotten and everything we've been longing to remember. The next story is called Echoes in the Empty Bell. In an ancient monastery nestled in a valley of wind and stone, there hung a large bronze bell in a high wooden tower. It hadn't been rung in many years. Its rope had worn away, and the monks, long ago, had chosen to leave it untouched. Still, the bell remained silent, still, waiting. Many visitors came to the temple over time. Some stood beneath the bell and shouted to test the echo. Some struck it with stones to hear its sound, but nothing happened. The bell stayed silent, holding its voice inside. A young monk once asked the abbot, "Why do we keep a bell that does not ring?" The abbot looked out toward the tower and said, because it still teaches. The young monk didn't understand, but the bell stayed with him, its silence both strange and powerful. He began visiting it each evening, sitting below the tower just as the sun dipped behind the hills. He sat without asking questions, without waiting for sound. He simply sat. And over time, he began to hear something new. Not a sound from the bell, but a sound inside himself. The thoughts he once held tightly began to soften. His mind stopped straining to understand. The stillness of the bell became the stillness of his breath. One night, as the wind moved through the valley, he closed his eyes and imagined what the bell once sounded like, deep, full, echoing into the mountains. But instead of sadness that it no longer rang, he felt peace. It had done its work. Now, in its silence, it offered something deeper. He returned to the abbot and said, "I think I understand now. The bell still echoes, just not with sound." The abbot smiled. "Some things ring more loudly in silence than they ever did in noise." Moral of the story: not all echoes are heard with the ears. Some are felt within. True understanding often arrives not through words or sound, but through presence, patience, and the silence we learn to trust. The next story is called The Brush That Painted Silence. In a quiet village nestled beside the sea, there lived an old painter who no longer sold his work. His home was filled with empty scrolls, and his hands, once known for their mastery, had grown slow with age. Yet every morning, before sunrise, he took out his brush, dipped it in ink, and painted in silence. People often wondered what he was creating. His scrolls never showed landscapes, nor flowers, nor dragons, or birds. In fact, they seemed almost blank. A single stroke here, a faint line there. Barely anything at all. One curious traveler, hearing tales of the quiet artist, made the journey to meet him. The traveler expected wisdom, beauty, maybe a grand philosophy. But when he arrived, the old man offered him tea and only said, "Sit, watch." The painter took his brush, dipped it once, and moved it across the paper in a single soft motion, nothing bold, just one curve of ink. Then he placed the brush down and looked at the traveler. The traveler blinked. "That's it?" he asked. The painter smiled and replied, "That is everything." The traveler was puzzled. "But there's barely anything on the page." The old man nodded. "And yet you paused. You looked closely. You waited. For that moment your mind stopped chasing and simply listened." The traveler fell silent. The painter continued, "The brush does not speak loudly. It points to what is already here. Silence is not emptiness, it is space. And space is where we meet ourselves." The traveler stayed for many days. He began to sit with the painter each morning, watching the strokes, then the stillness. Over time, he stopped waiting for something big to happen. He simply watched. And in that watching, something quiet inside him began to stir. Not noise, not thought, just presence. And when he left, he carried no painting with him, only the memory of still ink and the silence it had opened within him. Moral of the story: true art does not fill space, it reveals it. In the simplest moments, when we stop looking for more, we discover that silence itself is a teacher, and every quiet stroke carries a world. The next story is called A Smile Between Raindrops. Rain fell gently over the temple roofs, tapping softly on the stone walkways and dripping from the edge of the red-tiled eaves. The clouds had been thick for days, wrapping the mountains in a grey hush. The monks continued their daily practice, as always, moving through the mist like shadows sweeping, meditating, preparing simple mealsal in silence. But one monk, the youngest in the temple, felt weighed down. He had once loved the rain, but now it seemed to mirror the heaviness inside him. His thoughts clung to mistakes he had made, words he had left unsaid, and dreams that seemed far away now. The steady rhythm of the rain only made the ache more present. He couldn't seem to lift it. That afternoon, as he walked across the garden path with his head low and his robe damp, he passed the old master sitting alone beneath the temple awning. The master watched the rain with calm eyes, unmoved by the wetness or the cold. The young monk paused and asked quietly, "Master, how do you remain at peace when everything feels so heavy?" The master looked up, his face creased with age but softened by a gentle expression. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he pointed toward a single leaf, trembling with raindrops. One droplet balanced at its tip, ready to fall but still holding on. "Watch," he said simply. The monk looked. A breeze passed. The droplet slipped from the leaf and fell. And in the brief moment between its letting go and its landing, the master smiled. The young monk turned to him, puzzled. "There is a smile," the master said, "in that space between what was and what will be. Most miss it, because they're caught in the rain or waiting for it to end. But peace lives in the space between." The young monk stood silently for a while, feeling the rain on his skin. It was cool, steady, soft. And in the smallest breath between drops, he felt something loosen inside, a weight shifting, a quiet warmth rising, a smile not on his lips, but in his being. The rain continued, but he walked on lighter. Moral of the story: peace is not found after the storm or before the pain. It lives quietly in the spaces in between. When we pause and truly feel each moment, even in sorrow, we may find the gentle smile of life itself waiting for us. The next story is called "The Feather on the Meditation Matter." It was the season when birds returned to the hills, their songs weaving gently through the morning air. In the quiet meditation hall of a forest monastery, the windows were left open to let the breeze pass through, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant rustle of wings. One morning, before the first bell, a young monk entered the hall early, hoping to find calm before the others arrived. He had been struggling with restlessness. His mind, full of wandering thoughts, would not settle. No matter how long he sat, silence felt far away. As he approached his mat, he stopped. There, resting at the center of the mat, was a single feather-white, delicate, nearly weightless. It must have floated in through the open window during the night. It hadn't landed anywhere else. Just here, precisely where he was meant to sit. He stared at it, surprised by how something so small could capture his full attention. It moved slightly in the breeze, but did not fly away. It simply rested. Without thinking, the monk sat down before it. He didn't brush it aside. He didn't reach for it. He simply watched. Minutes passed, then more. The world around him softened. The feather, so still, became a mirror. His breath began to slow. His thoughts, once loud and sharp, grew quiet. He realized he didn't need to force his mind into silence. He only needed to be like the feather, resting without resistance, floating on the breath of the moment. The door creaked as another monk entered, then another. The room slowly filled with quiet bodies taking their seats. But the young monk remained with his eyes lowered, breathing gently, fully present. After the sitting was over, the abbot noticed the feather and smiled. "The wind carries its teachers gently," he said. "Some come in robes, some with wings." The young monk bowed his head. He said nothing. But he would remember that morning forever, not for any great teaching, but for the softness that had opened his heart. Moral of the story: stillness does not always arrive through effort. Sometimes it lands quietly, like a feather on a mat, reminding us that peace is not something we chase, it is something we allow. The next story is called "The Bowl That Filled with Snow." High in the mountains, where winter whispered through every pine needle and the air itself seemed made of silence, there stood a small hermitage with only one room and one door. An elderly monk lived there alone, having left the monastery years ago to seek deeper stillness. He owned very little, just a blanket, a wooden staff, and a single stone bowl he used for both food and water. Each morning, he would place the bowl outside before his meditation, as a symbol of offering not to receive, but to give. He believed even the empty bowl had a purpose. It caught light. It held silence. It reminded him to remain open. One winter, snow began to fall early and heavy. The winds howled, and for days the sky remained grey. The monk grew weaker with age and had less strength to gather food. Still, each morning, he placed the bowl outside and returned to his mat, his breath slow, his presence unwavering. One morning, the snow was especially deep. The monk's steps were unsure, his body thin. But still, he carried the bowl to its place by the door. He bowed to it, as he always did, and whispered, "Let this too be enough." As he sat in meditation, flakes began to fall soft, endless, silent. They drifted into the bowl one by one, with no rush, no thunder, just patience. The snow filled the bowl slowly, gently, until it overflowed, spilling into the earth around it. The bowl did not resist. It simply received. Later that day, a traveler lost in the storm stumbled upon the hermitage. Weary and cold, he knocked. The monk welcomed him in without hesitation. The traveler saw the empty shelves, the bare floor, the thin blanket and the bowl outside, now full of snow. The traveler asked, "You have so little. Why leave the bowl out each day?" The monk smiled, his face as weathered as the mountain itself. "Because it reminds me," he said, "that even emptiness, when left open, will one day be filled, not always with what we expect, but always with what we need." The traveler said nothing, but he never forgot the image of that bowl, full of snow, offered not as a request, but as a trust. Moral of the story: when we remain open even in stillness, even in lack, life finds a way to fill us. True peace comes not from clinging or striving, but from the quiet faith that all things arrive in their time. The next story is called A Path Made by Clouds. In the highlands, where the sky feels close enough to touch, there lived an old monk who often wandered alone. He never followed a trail. He walked wherever the wind led him, through fields of wildflowers, along rocky ledges, across shallow streams. When asked where he was going, he would only smile and point to the sky. "You cannot get lost," he once said, "if you are not trying to arrive." The younger monks found his words confusing. They were taught discipline, focus, structure. The idea of wandering without a goal seemed careless. Yet the old monk was never in a hurry, and wherever he arrived, he was fully there. He brought peace with him like a scent that lingered long after he had passed. One day, a novice followed him quietly, hoping to understand. The old monk walked into the hills at dawn, barefoot, robes brushing against the grass. Above them, the clouds moved slowly across the pale sky, no pattern, no hurry, yet always changing, always beautiful. The novice grew impatient. "Where are we going?" he finally asked. The old monk stopped and turned to him. "We're already there." The novice frowned. "But there is no path." The monk looked up, then watched the clouds. They stood in silence together. The sky above was full of slow, drifting clouds, some thick, some thin, all of them moving, forming and dissolving with ease. "They don't ask where they should go," the monk said quietly. "They just move. And in moving, they shape the sky. We often try so hard to walk the right path, but what if the path isn't built beneath us? What if we make it with every step?" The novice sat down in the grass. For the first time in his training, he did nothing not out of laziness, but out of listening. He watched the clouds, felt the sun on his skin, and heard the wind hum a tune without words. That evening, as they walked back together, the old monk said, "Some people need maps, others walk with the sky." Moral of the story: not all paths are visible. Sometimes the way forward is not found on the ground, but in the way we move through life with trust, openness, and the quiet grace of clouds drifting across the sky. The next story is called The Sleeping Sage's Dream. In a valley where rivers met and lotus flowers bloomed each spring, there lived a sage who had not spoken in many years. He was known not for his teachings, but for his stillness. He did not write scrolls or give long sermons. Instead, he spent his days resting beneath a fig tree, eyes closed, body still, as if he were always asleep. People came from far away to ask him questions, hoping to hear words of wisdom. But no matter the question about love, suffering, death, or enlightenment, the sage never spoke. He only slept, his face calm, his breath like the breeze over quiet water. At first, many left confused, even angry. "What good is a teacher who does not teach?" they would say. But others began to sit with him, drawn not by words, but by the deep peace that seemed to rise from his still body like incense. One day, a troubled woman came to the valley. Her heart was heavy with sorrow after losing her only child. She had visited temples and monks, read countless teachings, but nothing had softened her grief. In desperation, she came to the sage. She sat near him beneath the fig tree, tears falling silently. She waited for an answer that would not come. But after some time, as she wept beside him, her breathing began to match his. Slow, deep, unforced. She felt the warmth of the sun on her skin. She heard the rustling of the leaves above. And for the first time in many months, her heart did not tighten, it opened. That night, she slept beneath the tree, just a few feet from the sage. As dawn approached, she had a dream. In the dream, the sage was walking through a vast field of stars. He said nothing, only turned to her and smiled. The stars pulsed gently, not with light, but with a kind of knowing. And in that smile, she felt the truth she had been seeking, not an answer, but an acceptance. Not an escape from pain, but a place where pain could rest. She awoke as the sky began to glow with morning. The sage still slept, undisturbed. But within her, something had quietly awakened. Moral of the story: sometimes the deepest truths are not spoken, they are felt. In stillness, in presence, and even in dreams, wisdom can reach the heart in ways words never can. The next story is called Water That Waited. Far beyond the village roads, hidden between cliffs and pine-covered hills, there was a small, still pool of water. It was fed by no rushing stream and fed into no river. Rain came and went, seasons passed, and still the pool remained quiet, unchanged, waiting. The villagers called it the waiting pool. No one understood why. Some thought it was sacred, others believed it was simply forgotten. But the monks from a nearby temple visited often, especially when their hearts felt restless. One young monk, full of energy and questions, was sent there by his teacher after growing frustrated during meditation. "Go to the waiting pool," the teacher said. "Ask it nothing, just sit with it." The monk obeyed, though with little patience. He walked quickly, his mind still full of unfinished thoughts and emotions that tugged at him like wind on a flame. When he reached the pool, he was underwhelmed. It looked so ordinary, no clear reflections, no strange light. Just still, muddy water surrounded by moss and stone. He sat on a flat rock and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The water didn't ripple, the sky above didn't change. The monk grew agitated. "What is this supposed to teach me?" he muttered. And then something shifted, not in the pool, but in him. He realized how noisy he had been inside, how even in silence he was still asking, still demanding, still needing things to move. But the water asked for nothing. It did not flow to be seen. It did not stir to be understood. It simply was. He leaned forward and looked again. For the first time, he noticed the reflection dim, imperfect, but honest. His face, his expression, his impatience and his breath. And below that, something deeper, not an answer, but a presence. He returned to the pool the next day, and the next. Not to find something, but to sit with something that asked nothing of him. The more he came, the more he understood. The water had waited, not because it was still, but because it knew all things would come when they were ready. Moral of the story: some wisdom reveals itself not through movement, but through stillness. Like quiet water, peace does not chase eight weights. And when we are finally still enough to meet it, we realize it has been there all along. The next story is called The Gatekeeper Without a Gate. At the edge of a long-forgotten path, where forest met field and the wind carried stories from faraway lands, there sat a weathered man beneath an arch of ancient stone. He was known as the Gatekeeper, though there was no gate, just two worn pillars standing apart, holding nothing between them but open air and quiet space. Travelers often came upon him by accident. They would pause, confused, seeing no wall, no door, no city beyondly. The old man sitting cross-legged with a staff by his side and a gentle smile on his face. "Is this the entrance?" they would ask. He would nod. But entrance to what? The gatekeeper would only close his eyes and reply, "That depends on how you arrive." One impatient traveler scoffed and stepped through the space between the stones without another word. But as he continued down the path, he found himself growing angry. The road seemed longer, his burdens heavier. The silence mocked him. He returned days later, more tired than before, asking, "Where does your gate lead?" "I found nothing." The gatekeeper looked at him kindly and said, "That is what you brought with you, nothing. And that is what the path gave back." Another traveler, a woman weary from grief, approached and sat beside the gatekeeper. She asked no questions. She didn't try to walk forward. She simply sat, eyes lowered, her heart open and raw. The two sat in silence as the wind moved gently through the trees. After some time, she rose. The gatekeeper nodded to her, and she stepped through not into a different world, but into the same world with new eyes. Every tree seemed to breathe. Every stone felt steady. The pain in her heart was still there, but it no longer ruled her. She continued walking, lighter with each step. Years passed, and still the gatekeeper sat, watching people come and go, not guarding, not stopping, simply witnessing. He once whispered to a passing monk, "The gate is not made of stone or wood, it is made of presence, and the only thing it guards is the moment you choose to truly arrive." Moral of the story: some thresholds are not marked by walls or doors. They live in the space between awareness and distraction. When we cross into the present moment with openness, we pass through a gate that was always waiting for us to simply see it. The next story is called Lanterns That Never Flickered. In a small mountain temple nestled between cliffs, the monks held a tradition passed down for generations. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and shadows stretched across the stone paths, they lit a series of lanterns around the temple grounds. These lanterns, made of thin paper and delicate wood, were placed carefully along the walkways, beside the meditation hall, and near the garden's edge. But what made them extraordinary was this: no matter the wind, no matter the cold, the lanterns never flickered. Visitors often stared in wonder. Are they protected by glass? Some asked. Are they lit with special flames? But the monks never explained. They only smiled and invited the visitors to walk among them in silence. One evening, a young novice approached the head monk after watching the lanterns glow steadily through a storm. "How is it possible?" he asked. The wind was strong, yet not a single flame moved. The head monk did not answer right away. Instead, he motioned for the novice to follow him. They walked to the lantern room, where dozens of unlit lanterns hung from the ceiling. The monk picked up one and said, "The lantern's secret is not its strength. it's how it holds the flame. He gently opened the lantern to reveal a tiny, low-burning wick nestled deep in the center, shielded by thin folds that moved with the air rather than resisting it. "The flame does not fight the wind," the monk said. "It dances with it. It lives low, not high, quiet, not proud. That is why it stays." The novice stood silently, watching the gentle flicker of a new flame being lit. It glowed not with force, but with peace. And as he walked back through the temple paths, he looked again at the lanterns. They were not defiant, they were simply steady. Years later, when the novice became a teacher himself, he taught others the same lesson, not through lecture, but through a walk among lanterns that never flickered. Moral of the story: strength isn't found in resisting life's winds, it's in learning to glow quietly within them. When we burn with humility and steadiness, not even the strongest storm can take away our light. The next story is called The Sand Garden's Secret. Tucked behind the meditation hall of a quiet temple, there was a small sand garden, simple, precise, and silent. No flowers bloomed there, no trees offered shade. Only smooth white sand, carefully raked into flowing patterns around a few dark stones, each placed with intention. Every morning at sunrise, the same elderly monk would tend to the garden with a wooden rake, never rushing, never speaking, never changing much at all. Visitors often came to the temple expecting teachings, scriptures, or wise words. But the abbot would only smile and point toward the garden. "Sit there," he would say, "and you may hear something deeper." Many did, and many left puzzled. One morning, a restless monk in training came to the garden, feeling frustrated by the simplicity of his life at the temple. He wanted to understand things. He wanted enlightenment, clarity, purpose. The stillness of the sand made him anxious. He approached the old gardener and asked sharply, "What is the meaning of this garden? Why rake the same sand every day when the wind just blows it away?" The old monk did not look up. He drew the rake through the sand slowly, leaving behind a long curved trail. After a moment he answered, "Because the wind will come." The younger monk frowned. "Then why try at all?" The old man looked at him kindly. "Because I am not raking to fight the wind. I rake to understand myself." He placed the rake down and gestured to the garden. "The sand shifts, the stones do not. My thoughts are the sand, my awareness is the stone. Each morning I rake to remember which is which." The younger monk stood silently, watching the slow swirls of sand wrapping around the stones. He noticed how delicate they were, how carefully the lines curved and met. He watched the breeze lift a few grains and scatter them, gently erasing the patterns. But the stones remained, unmoved, constant. He sat down beside the old monk, saying nothing more. That morning, he did not seek answers. He only breathed. And for the first time, he felt the silence teaching him, wordlessly and well. Moral of the story: peace is not in stopping the wind, but in learning what remains when the wind has passed. In the simple acts we return to each day, we uncover what is real, steady, silent, and always within us. The next story is called The Tea Ceremony of the Cranes. At the edge of a quiet lake, surrounded by tall grasses and low-hanging willows, there was a small wooden tea house known only to a few monks, and the birds that visited each spring. The tea house had no walls, just a roof of woven reeds and a platform of polished wood, smoothed over time by bare feet and falling leaves. Every morning, before the sun lifted fully over the mountains, an old monk named Kenji would walk to this tea house and prepare tea. He brought no one with him. He said no words. Yet, always, two white cranes arrived, not together, not in a hurry, but always in time for the first pour of steam to rise into the air. He placed 3 cups before him, one for himself and one for each crane. Visitors often laughed quietly when they heard of this. Birds do not drink tea, they'd say. Why go through the motions for those who do not understand? But Kenji smiled, never correcting them. He knew the tea was not for drinking, it was for being. He sat slowly, moving with reverence. He poured the water, listened to the sound it made, watched the steam curl like incense. The cranes stood nearby, still and silent. They never begged, never flapped. They simply watched. Every motion of the monk was mirrored in the calm curve of their necks. One day, a young monk asked to join. "Can I come?" he said. "Even if I do not understand the meaning?" Kenji nodded. They walked in silence to the tea house. The cranes arrived shortly after. Together, the four of them sat monk, bird, bird. The tea was poured, slow and steady. The young monk watched Kenji's hands. He watched the crane's stillness. He listened to the sound of water, the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of breath. Something inside him settled. After the ceremony, he asked, "Why do the cranes come?" Kenji replied, "Perhaps for the same reason we do. Not to drink, but to remember how to be still, how to share space, and how to bow without words." Moral of the story: not all ceremonies are for teaching or doing. Some are for being. When we move with presence and grace, even the wildest hearts are drawn into silence, and in that silence we all become one. The next story is called A Raindrop's Reflection. A gentle rain had fallen all night, wrapping the temple grounds in a soft hush. By morning, the sky remained grey, and the air was cool with the scent of earth and stone. Puddles had formed between the stepping stones of the garden path, each holding a perfect mirror of the sky above. A young monk, walking slowly after meditation, stopped at one of these puddles. He looked down and saw his reflection staring back at him, eyes unsure, face tired, brows slightly furrowed with thoughts he couldn't quite name. It startled him. He had seen himself in mirrors before, but this was different. The reflection was softer, quieter, almost like it didn't belong to him at all. He knelt beside the puddle and touched its surface. The image rippled, disappeared, and slowly returned as the water settled. The temple's old abbot, watching from a distance, approached without sound. He stood beside the young monk for a while before speaking. "Your face looks heavy today," he said gently. The monk nodded. "I'm struggling, Master. I try to be kind, to be mindful, to let go. But I keep reacting, I keep judging, I keep failing. And when I look at myself, I don't see peace. I see someone I'm disappointed in." The abbot knelt slowly beside him and gazed into the same puddle. "This reflection," he said, "is only how the world appears in a raindrop. It is not the sky itself. When the wind stirs it, the image distorts. When the rain falls, it vanishes, but the sky, real sky, remains untouched." He placed a hand gently on the monk's shoulder. "So it is with your mind. The surface may ripple, cloud, or tremble, but beneath it, your true nature waits calm, open, unchanged." They sat together, watching the tiny circle of water. A single leaf drifted down and landed without a splash. The monk breathed in. The judgment in his chest softened. The sky above remained silent, endless, whole. He looked once more into the puddle, and this time didn't turn away. Moral of the story: what we see on the surface is not the whole truth. Our minds may ripple and cloud, but beneath every reaction and doubt, there is a quiet, self-clear, still, and waiting to be remembered. The next story is called The Pebble That Spoke First. Near a winding river at the foot of a misty mountain, there was a stone path leading to a forgotten shrine. The path was old stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, prayers, and silence. Among the many stones was a small, round pebble that most never noticed. It sat quietly near the edge, half sunk in the earth, watching the world with the patience only time could teach. Every week, A group of monks walked the path to sweep the shrine. Most passed by the pebble without thought, minds filled with chants or the day's work. But one monk, still young and full of questions, began to stop each time. He didn't know why. He just felt drawn to that one pebble, so small, so still, so certain of its place. One morning, he sat beside it. The wind moved gently through the trees, and the river sang softly in the distance. He spoke aloud, not expecting an answer. "I try so hard to be peaceful," he whispered, "to meditate, to listen, to let go. But the more I try, the louder everything becomes inside me." He waited, as if the pebble might reply. And in its silence, it did. He looked at it more closely. It hadn't moved in years. It wasn't trying to be noticed. It wasn't chasing stillness. It was stillness. It didn't resist the rain, the sun, or the steps that sometimes pressed against it. It had allowed everything. It had stayed with everything. And in doing nothing, it had become part of everything. Suddenly, the monk understood. He didn't need to force quiet. He didn't need to chase peace like a bird in the trees. He only needed to be like the pebble, present, grounded, and willing to be fully in the moment, no matter how loud or soft that moment was. From that day on, he still visited the shrine, but he always paused beside the pebble, and in time, others began to notice it too, not because it asked to be seen, but because stillness has a way of speaking first, even before a word is said. Moral of the story: peace does not come from effort alone. Like a pebble resting in the earth, true calm arises when we stop chasing and begin letting life move around us without losing our place within it. The next story is called "The Silence That Ended the Argument." Two monks walked side by side through a forest path, their robes brushing the leaves, the soft earth quiet beneath their feet. One was older, calm and steady like the trees that lined the trail. The other was younger, full of fire, his thoughts sharp, his questions endless, his heart pulled between right and wrong. That morning, the younger monk had witnessed an injustice in the village. A merchant had shouted cruel words at a beggar. No one intervened. The monk had clenched his fists in frustration. "How can we just watch and say nothing?" he had asked. "Isn't it our duty to speak up, to act?" Now, as they walked, his anger had not faded. He spoke fast, his voice cutting the still air. "Master, how can you remain silent? How can you be peaceful when the world is so full of suffering, of people doing harm? Isn't silence a form of approval?" The older monk said nothing. Frustrated, the younger monk continued, his voice rising. "If we do not argue against wrong, if we do not raise our voices, how can we change anything?" Still, no answer. They reached a clearing where the trees gave way to sunlight. A small stream trickled nearby, and birds moved through the branches. The older monk stopped and knelt, picking up a stone and placing it gently in the center of the path. He finally looked at the younger monk and said, "Speak to the stone, convince it to move." The younger monk furrowed his brow. "It won't move. It cannot listen." The older monk nodded. "Exactly. When someone's heart is hard like this stone, words will not move them. Not yet. But the stream nearby will wear down even the strongest rock with no shouting, no anger. Just presence, just patience." The young monk fell silent. The forest around them felt louder than his words had. Leaves rustled, water whispered. Somewhere, a bird sang a note that echoed and faded. In that moment, the younger monk realized the power in the quiet his teacher carried, not as a surrender, but as a strength deeper than argument. Moral of the story: sometimes the greatest change comes not from winning the argument, but from choosing silence. When words fail to open hearts, presence and patience can soften what force never could. The next story is called "A Dream of Empty Scrolls." In a monastery perched on the edge of a quiet cliff, Overlooking valleys painted with mist, there was a hall filled with scrolls. Hundreds of them lined neatly on shelves, some ancient, some freshly inked. They held the wisdom of generations, teachings, sutras, poems, and stories. The monks read them daily, studied their meanings, copied them with great care. Knowledge was honored here like sacred breath. One young monk, diligent and eager, spent every waking hour studying. He read long into the night, memorizing verses, writing down insights, trying to grasp the fullness of truth through every word he could find. But the more he read, the more unsettled he felt. His thoughts became crowded, tangled in meanings and contradictions. His mind was full, yet his heart remained heavy. One evening, exhausted, he fell asleep in the library, scrolls open around him. That night, he had a strange dream. In the dream, he stood in the same hall, but every scroll was blank. He rushed to one shelf, then another. All were the same. No words, no ink, just soft parchment unmarked by thought. Panic rose in him. The teachings were gone, the wisdom erased. He fell to his knees and wept. Then a soft voice spoke, though no one was there. The truth has never lived in words. He looked up. The scrolls began to glow faintly in the moonlight, and in their silence he felt something he had never known before: spaciousness, peace. He didn't need to read. He didn't need to understand. He only needed to be still. When he woke the next morning, the library was as it had been filled with words, filled with meaning. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer read to collect ideas. He read slowly, letting the silence between lines speak louder than the sentences. He no longer feared forgetting, because now he knew what couldn't be forgotten had never been written in ink. Moral of the story: wisdom lives not only in words, but in the silence that surrounds them. When we empty our minds of grasping, we create space for understanding deeper than thought, truth that speaks without being spoken. The next story is called The Flower That Faced the Wall. In the inner courtyard of a quiet Zen temple, there grew a single white flower, small, delicate, and unnoticed by most. Unlike the others that bloomed toward the sunlight, this flower had grown facing a blank stone wall. It was tucked in a shadowed corner, beyond the reach of the wind, beyond the sight of many eyes. A novice monk, sweeping the courtyard each morning, began to notice it. At first, he found it strange. Why would a flower grow in the wrong direction? Why not turn to the light like the others? He brought his question to the temple's teacher, an old monk who rarely offered answers, only suggestions to look more deeply. "Perhaps it sees something others cannot," the teacher said simply. Still, the novice was curious. Each day, he watched the little flower, half expecting it to change direction. But it never did. It bloomed quietly, fully, without turning, without seeking the sun like the rest, and somehow it looked content. One evening, the novice sat alone by the flower as dusk settled in. He found himself reflecting on his own path, how often he had compared himself to the other monks, tried to copy their form, their voices, their pace. He had chased enlightenment the way others chased approval. Yet something inside him still felt unsettled. As he stared at the flower gently leaning toward the stone, something softened in him. He realized the flower was not wrong. It didn't bloom for praise. It didn't bloom to be seen. It bloomed because that was its nature. Even facing a wall, it gave everything it had. Its beauty wasn't in its position, but in its quiet offering, without need, without fear. The wall didn't reflect light, but it reflected stillness. And that night, for the first time, the novice felt no need to become anything other than what he already was. He sat in silence beside the flower until the moon rose high and the courtyard filled with silver light. Moral of the story: true growth does not depend on direction, attention, or applause. Even when we face silence, Even when no one sees us, we can still bloom fully. Real peace comes from honoring our path, no matter where it leads. The next story is called The Echo That Learned to Listen. High in the mountains, where the cliffs dropped sharply into clouds, and even the wind seemed to tread softly, there was a narrow valley known for its echoes. If you stood at just the right spot and called out, your voice would return to you again and again, fainter each time, but still your own. Travelers would shout their names into the canyon, laugh at the sound of their joy bouncing back, and then move on. But once, long ago, a monk climbed into that valley not to shout, but to sit. He had spent many years in silence, outwardly calm, inwardly restless. No matter how still his posture, his mind spun like a wheel. He had studied the teachings, chanted every sutra, and memorized the words of great masters. Yet, deep inside, a question remained unanswered. Why does peace feel so far away, even in silence? He had heard stories of the echoing valley and thought perhaps it could give him something the scrolls could not. When he arrived, he stood and whispered a single word: peace. The word echoed faintly, then faded. He waited, then said, "Who am I?" The mountains replied with his own voice, "Who am I? Who am I?" Frustrated, he tried again. "Why can't I find stillness?" And again, the question returned to him unchanged. He sat down, disheartened. "All I hear is myself," he whispered. Then he grew quiet, not just in speech, but in thought. He stopped asking. He stopped searching. He listened not for an answer, but for everything else. He began to notice the space between echoes, the wind brushing the cliffs, the cry of a hawk, the crackle of small stones shifting beneath him. All the sounds he had never heard before because he had always been speaking. For the first time in his life, he was not waiting for his voice to return. He was receiving the world as it was. He stayed for 3 days. He said little, but he listened deeply. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to be answered, it was to thank the silence for teaching him how to hear. Moral of the story: we often speak to fill the silence, but true peace comes when we learn to listen. In letting go of our need to be echoed, we finally hear what's been quietly waiting all along. The next story is called The Monk and the Invisible Thread. In a monastery nestled between 2 rivers, there lived a monk known for his kindness. He was not the most scholarly, nor the most disciplined, but he had a way of making people feel seen, even without speaking. Whenever someone was in pain, they would find comfort simply by sitting near him, as though something unseen passed between their hearts. One afternoon, a traveler arrived, worn and bitter from years of disappointment. He had studied under many teachers, followed many paths, but peace had always escaped him. He asked the monk, "Why do others speak so highly of you? You offer no teachings, no miracles. What is it that you give them?" The monk only smiled and poured tea. Frustrated, the traveler insisted, "Words have power. Wisdom needs to be shared, spoken, explained. If you have something to offer, say it." Still, the monk said nothing. He simply handed the traveler the cup, his hands warm, his eyes calm. The traveler drank slowly, and for a while, silence filled the room. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that softens the edges of the world. When the cup was empty, the traveler looked up and found his breath had slowed. His chest no longer felt so tight. Later that evening, he returned and found the monk in the garden, tying a thread between 2 bamboo poles. The thread was so thin it was barely visible in the fading light. The monk motioned for the traveler to come closer. "This thread," he said gently, "holds nothing, carries nothing, and yet it connects." The traveler furrowed his brow. "Connects what?" The monk looked toward the hills. "What's needed?" He went on, "There are threads between all of us. You can't see them. You can't grasp them. But they're in the way we listen, in the way we breathe beside someone, in the care we give without needing to speak. The traveler stood very still. He thought of all the teachers who had lectured, all the books he had read, all the seeking he had done, and how, in this moment, without answers or noise, something inside him had finally begun to rest. Moral of the story: not all wisdom is spoken. Often, the deepest connections are invisible, carried in silence, presence, and compassion. When we stop trying to prove and start simply being, the heart finds what words never could. The next story is called A Sutra Whispered by Wind. There was a small temple on a hill where the grass grew wild and the wind never rested. No gates guarded it, no walls enclosed it. It was open to the sky, open to the breath of the earth, and always filled with sound not of voices, but of rustling leaves, swaying grasses, and wind passing through bamboo chimes hung gently from the eaves. The temple had only one monk, an old man named Riku, whose hearing had faded with age. He no longer heard words clearly, but he still listened. Every morning he would sit at the edge of the hill with his eyes closed and his robes pressed gently by the breeze. One day, a scholar visited the temple. He had studied every sutra he could find. His scrolls were marked with notes, his memory full of words. But still, something eluded him. His mind was sharp, but his heart was tired. He asked the old monk, "Which sutra do you meditate on here?" The old monk smiled and pointed to the wind. The scholar frowned. "But the wind speaks nothing. It has no verses, no teachings." The monk simply raised a finger to his lips and closed his eyes again. The scholar stayed, not out of belief, but out of confusion. He sat beside the monk, impatient at first, then curious, then quiet. As the hours passed, he began to hear more. The wind was not silent, it was layered with sound. The sigh of tree branches, the trembling of prayer flags, the hush of grass brushing against stone. It was not speaking in words, but in rhythm, in presence, in movement. And suddenly, he understood. The sutras were never just ink on paper. They were life itself when fully seen, fully heard, and fully felt. The wind carried no doctrine, yet in its touch was the same truth spoken by sages. This moment is sacred. The scholar wept softly, and the wind brushed the tears from his cheeks without judgment. Moral of the story: not all teachings are written. Some truths arrive with no words at all. When the mind grows still and the heart opens wide, even the wind can become a sutra-whispering piece in the language of presence. The next story is called The Breath That Vanished. A monk sat at the edge of a wide, quiet lake, watching the morning mist rise like a dream from the surface of the water. He had been practicing breath meditation for many years, watching the inhale and the exhale with focused awareness. It had brought him calm, but also frustration. The more he tried to control his breath, the more it slipped from his grasp, sometimes shallow, sometimes tense, sometimes lost altogether. One day he asked the abbot, "Why does the breath feel like something I must chase? The more I try to hold it, the more it disappears." The abbot looked at him with soft eyes and said, "Then stop chasing it." The monk frowned. "But the breath is the anchor. If I lose it, how will I stay present?" The abbot walked to the water's edge and pointed to the lake. "Look at the reflection of the sky. Do you try to catch it with your hands?" "No," the monk replied. "Why not?" "Because it isn't meant to be held." The abbot nodded. "Your breath is the same." That night, the monk returned to the lake alone. He sat in silence and began his meditation not with effort, not with control, but with surrender. He did not follow the breath. He allowed it. He let it come and go like clouds in the sky or ripples on the lake. For the first time, he did not try to breathe mindfully. He simply allowed breath to breathe itself. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, something strange happened. The breath vanished. Not in fear, not in tension, but in peace. There was no breath, no body, no thought, only space. A vast, gentle silence where breath had once been. And in that space, he did not feel absence. He felt presence. When he finally stood, the stars had begun to gather in the sky. He walked back to the temple slowly, as if each step was part of the breath now, the same way wind moves through trees unseen, but always there. Moral of the story: peace is not found in controlling the breath, but in letting go of control. When we stop trying to hold each moment, we discover it was already holding us all along. The next story is called Stillness Beneath the Willow. At the far end of the monastery garden, just beyond the koi pond and beside a worn stone bench, there grew an old willow tree. Its branches hung low, brushing the surface of the grass like soft fingers tracing the earth. The monks rarely sat beneath it. They said the shade was too deep, the silence there too heavy. But one monk, an older woman named Aya, sat there every day. She would come just before dawn, before the birds began their morning songs. While the temple slowly came to life, she sat in stillness beneath the willow, her posture like the trunk grounded, calm, unmoving. A young monk once watched her from a distance. He was new, filled with questions, and still trying to understand what stillness truly meant. His thoughts wandered even in meditation. His body fidgeted. His breath raced ahead of him. But Ayashi sat without effort, like the willow itself had taught her how. One morning, unable to resist, he approached her. He bowed quietly and said, "Teacher, when I sit, I feel restless. I try to still my thoughts, but they only get louder. Yet you sit so silently. How do you make the stillness come?" Aya opened her eyes, but her gaze remained soft and far away, as if she was still listening to something deeper than the world around her. "I don't make it come," she said. "I let it find me." The monk tilted his head. "But how do you let it?" Aya reached up and gently touched one of the willow's long branches. It swayed with the lightest breeze, never stiff, never resisting. "The willow doesn't fight the wind," she said. "And it doesn't chase stillness either. It simply allows both. That's its secret." She looked at him. When you stop trying to hold still and simply allow what is, you become still by nature. The stillness doesn't come from you. It comes through you. The young monk sat beside her then, saying nothing. Above them, the willows swayed. Around them, the garden stirred. But within them, something quietly began to settle. Moral of the story: stillness is not forced, it is allowed. When we stop resisting the movement within us and stop chasing peace like a prize, we find that it has been waiting all along beneath the branches of our own breath. The next story is called The Unpainted Mandala. In a quiet monastery high in the snowy mountains, there lived a monk known for his exquisite mandalas. Made from colored sand, his creations were breathtaking circles within circles, layers of sacred patterns that mirrored the universe itself. Visitors traveled far to witness his work. They marveled at the precision, the colors, and the way each design seemed to breathe with meaning. But the monk never kept them. As soon as a mandala was finished, he would sweep it away with a single breath of wind or the stroke of his hand. "Nothing is permanent," he would say softly, "not even beauty." One winter, he was asked to teach the novices how to create a mandala for the Festival of Light. The young monks gathered eagerly, expecting to learn technique, symbolism, and discipline. Instead, the monk brought them to an empty room, placed a bowl of sand in the center, and said nothing. Days passed. Still, he gave no instruction. The novices grew restless. "Master," one finally asked, "when will we begin? The mandala must be completed in time." The old monk smiled and knelt beside the bowl. He drew a single line in the sand, then smoothed it away. "You are waiting to begin," he said. "But the mandala already lives in your mind, in your hands, in the space before anything is created." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white sky. Some patterns are never drawn, some beauty is never seen, but that doesn't mean it's not real. The novices were confused, but one remained behind long after the others left. She sat beside the bowl, hour after hour, tracing shapes that no one would see, letting them vanish before they were complete. Her breathing slowed, her heart softened. In the act of not finishing, she found a quiet joy she had never known before. The day of the festival arrived, and the room meant for the mandala was empty, just smooth sand, untouched. Some were disappointed, but the old monk only smiled. "Look closely," he said. "There is more presence in what was never painted than in all that we try to preserve." Moral of the story: not all creations must be completed to be meaningful. In letting go of outcome, we meet the true heart of practice, presence, patience, and the silent beauty of impermanence. The next story is called The Bell Tower That Sang Alone. At the edge of a forgotten village stood an old bell tower, built long before the stone paths and rice fields below it took shape. Time had worn its wood grey and softened the ring of its once mighty bell. No monks tended it now, no rope hung from the beam, no hand had touched the bell in years. And yet, on certain mornings especially, when fog lingered in the valleys and the wind moved slow and low, the bell would sing. No one ever saw it move, no one heard it strike, but a soft humming tone would rise from the tower, not loud, not sharp, but deep and warm, like a memory returned in a dream. The villagers called it the bell that sings alone, and often paused their chores to listen. Some thought it was a trick of the wind. Others said the mountain spirits had adopted the bell's song. But one day, a young monk from a nearby monastery decided to visit the tower, drawn by the mystery and the stillness that seemed to wrap around its name. He climbed the steep trail at dawn, arriving just as the light touched the peaks. He sat beneath the tower and waited. He didn't bring incense, he didn't bring questions, only breath and quiet. For a long while, there was only silence. Then, just as the morning sun brushed the highest stones, came the sound. It did not strike like a bell. It pulsed, as if born from the air itself. The monk closed his eyes. He felt the tone in his chest, not as a sound, but as a presence. The bell was not being run, it was remembering, not calling for anyone, but being heard. When the sound faded, the monk remained still, now understanding. Some things do not need to be struck to sing. Some truths do not wait for permission to be known. The bell was not waiting for someone to make it useful again. It had become its own voice, its own silence, its own teacher. He bowed to the tower before descending, carrying with him not just the memory of the sound, but the space it had left behind. Moral of the story: you do not need to be called upon to hold value. Like the bell that sings without being struck, your presence alone can be a quiet song, heard most clearly in the stillness you allow yourself to become. The next story is called A Turtle at the Temple Door. On a warm afternoon, the temple gates stood open, as they always did, welcoming the breeze and the passing footsteps of those seeking peace. The courtyard was quiet, the cherry blossoms just beginning to fall, their petals floating gently to the ground like soft thoughts. That day, a turtle appeared, slow, old and dust-colored, with a shell worn smooth by time. It made its way from the riverbank, across the stony path, and up the temple steps, pausing at the threshold. The monks inside noticed it but said nothing. They simply watched. The turtle did not enter. It sat there, motionless, just before the door, as if unsure whether to go in or as if it already had. A young monk, curious, came forward and asked the abbot, "Should I help it inside?" The abbot shook his head gently. "It knows how to walk, and it knows how to wait." Hours passed. The turtle remained where it was. Visitors stepped around it with care. A few bowed to it in playful reverence. Still, the turtle did not move. The young monk grew restless. "Why would it come all this way and stop before entering?" he asked. "Doesn't it want what's inside?" The abbot smiled. "Perhaps it already found it." That evening, as the sun cast golden light through the temple's paper walls, the turtle slowly turned and began its journey back toward the river. The young monk followed for a while, then stopped. He looked back at the temple, then at the turtle, then at the path beneath his feet. He realized something. The turtle had come, not for the teachings on the scrolls or the chants in the hall, but for the quiet space between arrival and return. It had paused at the door, not to be welcomed, but to simply be. No striving, no seeking, just presence. That night, the young monk sat alone on the steps where the turtle had rested, and for the first time in weeks, he did not try to understand Zen. He just breathed and let the silence open like the sky. Moral of the story: not every journey ends with entering. Sometimes peace is found in the pause before the threshold, in simply being where you are, without needing to go further. The next story is called The Raft Without a River. In a dry and dusty courtyard behind a remote monastery, there lay an old wooden raft, weathered, cracked, its ropes frayed with age. It had no place among the stones and sand, where no river flowed and no lake sparkled nearby. Most monks passed it without thought, assuming it had been brought from far away and forgotten. But one day, a novice, curious by nature and quiet by heart, approached the abbot and asked, "Why do we keep a raft when there is no river?" The abbot smiled and said, "Because the river was never the point." The novice was puzzled, but the abbot placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sit with it, ask it nothing, let it speak." So the novice did. He sat beside the raft for many days after morning chants, before evening meals. No words came, no insight struck him. But over time, he began to notice how the sun warmed the old wood, how wind sang through the empty gaps where rope once held tight, how time had shaped the raft not with water, but with silence. One evening, while sitting there, the novice had a thought, gentle and sudden, like a leaf falling into still water. Not everything we carry is meant to be used forever. He saw now this raft had once helped someone cross a great river, perhaps a journey filled with fear or hope, urgency or release. It had served its purpose, and now it rested, not broken, not lost, just no longer needed to float. He thought of his own mind, how many teachings he clung to, how many habits and thoughts he carried, afraid to let go. But maybe, like the raft, some things were meant only to bring us to the other shore. The next morning, the novice returned to the abbot and bowed deeply. "I understand," he said. "The raft stays not to carry, but to remind." The abbot nodded. "And so do we." Moral of the story: not all tools are meant to be kept forever. Some things serve us for a time, then must be released. Wisdom lies not in clinging, but in knowing when to set down the raft, grateful, gentle, and free to walk forward. The next story is called The Pillow Made of Moonlight. In a quiet room at the far end of the temple, there was a window that faced the open sky. Each night, the moon would rise slowly, pouring its light through the wooden lattice and resting softly on the floor like a blanket of silver silk. It touched the walls, the robes folded neatly in the corner, and the meditation cushion placed by the bed. An old monk slept there, known for his peaceful dreams and the gentle smile he carried even in sleep. The younger monks often wondered how he found such deep rest night after night, while they struggled to settle their minds. One evening, one of them finally asked, "Master," he said, kneeling beside him before bed. "How do you fall asleep so easily?" "I lie down, but my thoughts chase me. My past, my doubts, my future, they keep me awake. But your face is calm, like you are already dreaming before your eyes even close." The old monk laughed softly. "It is not my bed that brings me rest," he said. "It is what I rest my mind upon." The young monk looked confused. "What do you mean?" The master pointed to the patch of moonlight spreading across his pillow. "Each night, I imagine this light as my pillow. I lay my thoughts there, one by one, and let them be held by something greater than me, soft, steady, and always returning." He closed his eyes. "I do not fight my thoughts. I give them to the moon. I say, 'Here, hold them while I sleep,' and the moon never refuses." That night, the young monk returned to his room. As the moonlight crept across his floor, he sat quietly. He gathered the weight in his heart not to fix it, not to carry it, but to place it gently into the soft glow on his pillow. Then he lay down, and for the first time in many nights, his mind did not argue. It rested, not because the world had changed, but because he had allowed the moon to hold what he no longer needed to. Moral of the story: peaceful rest comes not from silencing the mind, but from trusting it to something larger than worry. When we learn to let go even for a night, the moonlight will hold what we can't, with quiet grace. The next story is called A Flame in the Fog. The valley was known for its thick morning fog. It would roll down from the mountains in heavy waves, softening the edges of the world. Trees became shadows, paths disappeared, and even the temple bell could barely be heard. It was a beautiful fog, but also disorienting. Travelers often lost their way. Monks learned to walk slowly, carefully, trusting their feet more than their eyes. One morning, a young monk was assigned to bring back water from the well beyond the lower ridge. He had walked the path many times before, but that day the fog was unusually deep. Within minutes, he could no longer see the trail. Each step felt uncertain. The silence around him was thick, and doubt crept in like cold air under a door. Fear began to rise. He stopped, unsure if he was going forward or circling back. His breath quickened. He felt alone, hidden inside a world that no longer responded. But then, far ahead, barely visible through the mist, there was a flame. A single lantern, flickering gently but steady. Without thinking, he moved toward it, slowly, carefully. The closer he came, the warmer the air felt, the softer his breath became. When he reached it, he found another monk standing there silently, holding the lantern with both hands. The young monk bowed. "Thank you," he whispered. "I was lost." The monk with the lantern smiled and said, "So was I, until I stopped trying to see everything." They stood together in silence. The fog did not lift, but it no longer frightened. The lantern's flame was not powerful, but it was enough. Enough to see the next step. Enough to remember that not all light comes to chase away the darksome, comes simply to remind us we are not alone. The young monk returned to the temple later than expected, his robes damp with mist, but his heart lighter than when he had left. Moral of the story: when the path is unclear and doubt surrounds us, we don't need all the answers, just one small light held with presence. Even the softest flame can guide us through the fog, one step at a time. The next story is called The Master Who Drew with Water. In a sun-washed courtyard of a quiet Zen temple, there lived a master who had once been a great calligrapher. His scrolls had adorned temples, palaces, and the homes of emperors. His brush was said to move like wind over still water, swift, graceful, and full of life. But one day, without warning, he stopped painting. He gave away his brushes, packed away his inks, and spent his days sweeping the garden or sitting beneath the plum tree in silence. The younger monks missed his art. Visitors came and asked, "Why does the master no longer create?" But he only smiled and pointed to the sky or the river, saying, "There is more than one way to leave a mark." Then one summer afternoon, something changed. He walked into the center of the courtyard, carrying nothing but a bowl of water. With the monks watching quietly from the edges, he dipped his hand into the bowl, bent down, and began drawing on the warm stone floor with his fingers. No ink, no brush, just water. He traced arcs, circles, and characters in a language too soft to stay. Within moments, the heat of the stone began to dry the water, and the drawings disappeared first at the edges, then all at once. Gone, as if never made. The monks were puzzled. "Why create something that will vanish before anyone can understand it?" one asked. The master looked at the drying stone and said, "Because not all beauty is meant to be kept, and not all meaning must remain." He paused. "The truth is not in the mark itself, but in the moment of its making, the breath, the movement, the letting go." From that day on, he returned each morning to draw with water. Some days his fingers traced poems, other days nothing but quiet curves. Sometimes monks sat beside him, learning to draw without attachment, knowing each line would vanish, yet still giving it their full heart. No scrolls were saved, no images remained, only the stillness that lingered long after the water had gone. Moral of the story: impermanence is not loss, it is a deeper kind of freedom. When we create without clinging, love without holding, and live without needing to leave a trace, we find the purest form of peace. The next story is called The Koan That Answered Itself. At a quiet temple tucked between two hills, the head monk was known for giving each student a single koana riddle, not meant to be solved by thinking, but by seeing with the heart. Monks would meditate on them for years, turning the questions over like stones in a stream, wearing down the sharp edges with silence and time. One day, a young monk named Haru was given a koan that puzzled him more than any before. The question was this: who is the one who asks? He bowed deeply to the master, took the koan to heart, and began his search. Day after day, he sat beneath the cedar trees. He wrote in his journal. He fasted. He recited sutras. He asked the birds, the breeze, even his own reflection, but the question only echoed back. Who is the one who asks? He tried answering it with logic. The self, the seeker, the illusion of ego. None brought peace. None quieted the echo. Years passed. Frustration turned into sorrow. His longing for enlightenment became heavy, and one evening, under a cold moon, Haru broke down in tears beside the temple wall. He whispered, "Why do I keep searching for something I cannot find?" In that moment, a leaf drifted down from the tree and landed on his knee. He didn't brush it away. He didn't think about it. He just watched it rest there light, still, perfect. A breeze came and carried it away. And suddenly, without warning, the koan answered itself. Not in words, but in silence. Not in thought, but in presence. There was no asker separate from the asking. There was only this moment bare, open and complete. He began to laugh, not with pride, but with deep relief. The koan had never needed solving. It had only waited for him to stop chasing the answer and become the space where the question could dissolve. The next morning, he bowed to the master and said nothing. The master smiled. He too said nothing. They sat together in stillness. Moral of the story: some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to undo the one who asks. When we stop seeking from the mind and begin listening with our whole being, the truth reveals itself not as an answer, but as freedom. The next story is called The Walk to Nowhere. At sunrise, a monk stepped beyond the gates of his temple and began to walk. He did not pack food, he did not carry a map, he did not know where the path led. The sky was soft with morning light, and the earth beneath his sandals was cool and damp with dew. He simply walked. Another monk, watching from the temple steps, called out, "Where are you going?" The walking monk turned, smiled, and said, "Nowhere." This puzzled the others. Why walk without a destination? Why leave if nothing waits at the end? Some thought he was lost in his practice, or perhaps in his mind. But the walking monk did not explain. Each morning he walked. Each evening he returned dust on his robes, peace in his eyes. One day, a young novice who had grown tired of structure and silence followed him. They walked side by side in the quiet morning. Birds sang in the trees. Leaves fell without sound. After some time, the novice asked, "If you're going nowhere, why do you walk at all?" The monk looked ahead and replied, "Because it is not the end that gives the path meaning, it is the walking." They passed a stream and paused to drink. The water was clear and cold. The monk continued, "When we always walk to reach something, we miss the ground beneath us. We miss the wind on our skin, the sound of the world breathing. We forget to arrive in each step." The novice fell silent. He noticed for the first time the way his feet touched the earth, how each step had a rhythm, how the sunlight warmed only part of the path while the rest waited in shadow. He realized he had spent his days moving toward goals, not moments. They walked on without words. When they returned to the temple, the novice bowed deeply. He said nothing, but the monk nodded as if he understood. That day, the novice took his first walk, not to become enlightened, not to solve anything, but simply to walk, step by step, into presence. Moral of the story: not all journeys need a destination. Sometimes, the most meaningful path is the one walked without striving, where each step is the arrival, and peace is found not at the end, but in the motion itself. The next story is called "The Dew That Greeted the Master." Before the sun touched the rooftops of the temple, before the chants rose and the bells rang, the garden shimmered in silence. Each blade of grass, each leaf and petal held a single moment of stillness in the form of dew. Tiny, perfect droplets unnoticed by most, but shining like stars in the morning light. The master of the temple, an old monk with gentle eyes and slow steps, always walked the garden before the day began. He never spoke during this walk. He carried no broom, no prayer beads, only presence. And the dew, it seemed, waited for him. One morning, a young monk, eager to understand the master's calm, rose early and followed at a distance. He watched the master walk, pausing here and there, bending once to touch a flower, stopping once to look up at a single cloud. He said nothing, yet everything about him felt full, as if he were in conversation with the world itself. When they returned to the temple steps, the young monk bowed and asked, "Master, why do you walk the garden each morning without speaking, without teaching, without doing?" The master looked at him and smiled. "Because the dew teaches before I do." The young monk tilted his head. "But the dew disappears so quickly." The master nodded. "Exactly." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "The dew knows how to live. It arrives without force. It rests without fear. It reflects the whole sky in a single drop, and then, when the sun rises, it lets go. It clings to nothing." The young monk stood quietly, looking back toward the garden where the dew was already fading. What once sparkled now returned to the air, leaving no mark, yet the moment it gave had changed something in him. That day, during meditation, the boy felt different, not because he tried harder, but because something had softened. Like the dew, he began to understand the beauty of simply being and the grace of letting go. Moral of the story: Some of life's greatest teachings last only a moment. When we meet them with stillness, even something as brief as morning dew can show us how to live fully, reflect clearly, and release gently. The next story is called A Nap Beneath the Paper Lantern. In the shaded corner of a small countryside temple, there hung an old paper lantern. It was handmade, its frame slightly crooked, the rice paper faded with time. During the day, it swayed gently in the breeze, catching patches of sunlight that danced across its surface like soft whispers. Beneath it, on most afternoons, an elderly monk could be found napping. While others studied sutras or swept the temple paths, he would lay his straw mat under the lantern's warm glow, hands folded, breath slow, his face resting in the softest smile. Some younger monks questioned his habit. "He sleeps too often," they whispered. "Shouldn't he be meditating or teaching?" But the abbot only smiled and said, "Sometimes stillness looks like sleep, and sometimes sleep holds the deepest stillness." One curious novice approached the old monk one day and asked, "Why do you nap here every day? Don't you worry that you're wasting time?" The old monk opened his eyes, unhurried, and looked up at the lantern. It swayed slightly above them, catching the light of the setting sun. "I nap here," he said softly, "because this is where I learned to stop chasing." He gestured toward the lantern. "When I was younger, I tried to grasp everything: wisdom, enlightenment, perfection. I filled my days with striving, thinking the more I did, the faster I would arrive. But I grew tired. My mind grew louder. One day, I collapsed beneath this lantern, too weary to continue. And in that quiet moment, doing nothing, something shifted." He closed his eyes again. "I listened to the wind. I felt my breath. I let go. And in that letting go, I found a peace I'd never reached through effort." The novice sat down beside him, unsure what to say. He looked at the lantern, fragile, imperfect, glowing softly in the breeze. And he understood. Peace does not always come wrapped in discipline or silence. Sometimes it arrives in the spaces we stop trying to fill. The lantern swayed. The old monk dozed off once more, and the novice remained still, learning the art of rest. Moral of the story: true peace doesn't always come through effort. Sometimes the deepest wisdom is found in rest, in letting go of the need to strive, and allowing stillness to find us exactly where we are. The next story is called The Tea That Remembered. In the heart of a quiet temple tucked between rolling hills, there lived an elderly monk who brewed tea every afternoon. He never missed a day. Rain or shine, celebration or sorrow, at the same hour, he would enter the tea room, light a single candle, and begin the gentle practice he had done for over 60 years. His movements were slow and deliberate. He rinsed the cups with warm water. He measured the leaves by feel, not scale. He poured with both hands, bowing slightly to the steam rising from the pot. The tea, simple and unremarkable by name, always tasted different in his presence, calmer, deeper, somehow more alive. A young monk, curious and new to the temple, once asked to watch. The elder welcomed him in with a nod and said nothing. The boy sat quietly, hoping to learn a technique, a secret, something to explain the peace that filled the room as the tea was prepared. But the old monk did not instruct. He only brewed. The young monk returned the next day, and the next. For weeks he watched in silence, and slowly he began to notice more the sound of the kettle before it boiled, the way the monk exhaled before lifting the pot, the pause between pouring and offering. Nothing was rushed, nothing wasted. One day the boy asked, "Master, why does your tea feel different than when I make it the same way?" The monk smiled and replied, "Because the tea remembers." The boy frowned. "Remembers what?" The old monk held up the cup between his palms. It remembers the hands that held it, the mind that prepared it, the heart that poured it. Tea does not need perfection, it only needs presence. The boy looked down at his own hands. He understood then that tea was never just about leaves and water. It was a mirror. It reflected everything brought into its making: rushed thoughts, quiet breath, gratitude, distraction. From that day on, the boy brewed differently. He brewed as if the tea could feel, as if the water could hear, as if each cup was a moment the world might remember. Moral of the story: what we do is shaped by how we do it. Even the smallest act holds memory. When we move with care and full presence, we leave behind more than results, we leave behind peace. The next story is called A Mountain That Meditated. Far beyond the crowded villages and the noisy cities, there stood a mountain so ancient that no one remembered its name. Its peak was often hidden by clouds, its slopes covered in pines and moss, and its base wrapped in quiet mist. The people who lived near it called it the Still One, because no matter what the weather brought, rain, wind, thunder, or sun, the mountain never moved. It simply stood, year after year, in silence. A wandering monk once made a pilgrimage to that mountain. He had heard legends that those who climbed its paths often found answers without asking questions. At the time, his heart was full of restlessness. Though he had studied many teachings and visited many temples, something inside him remained unsettled. He hoped the mountain would show him what he was missing. For days he climbed, through fog and birdsong, across rocky ledges and soft green meadows. At night, he slept beneath the stars. He did not pray, he did not speak. He simply walked and watched. Eventually, he reached a high ridge where the wind was cold and the sky wide. He sat facing the horizon, the world spread before him. Hours passed, then more. The mountain said nothing. The monk began to grow impatient. "Why have I come here?" he thought. "What is the lesson?" But the mountain did not answer. He listened more closely. There was no voice, only wind, only stillness. He closed his eyes, and then he saw not with his eyes, but with something quieter inside. The mountain had been meditating all along. It did not resist the wind. It did not argue with the sky. It did not try to change the seasons. It simply remained present, grounded, vast. The monk realized that all his searching had been a kind of movement and effort to climb toward peace. But the mountain was teaching something deeper, that peace does not always come by moving forward, but by becoming still. He bowed to the earth beneath him, and for the first time, he did not seek the next answer. He let the silence be enough. Moral of the story: like a mountain, true peace comes not from chasing, but from presence. When we stop striving to change every moment and instead rest within it, we begin to understand the stillness that was always waiting inside us. The next story is called The Master Who Listened to Shadows. In a monastery carved into the side of a quiet mountain, there lived a master who was known not for his lectures, but for his listening. He rarely gave formal teachings. Instead, students came to him with their burdens, doubts, fears, longings, and he listened. He would nod slowly, offer tea, and sometimes say nothing at all. Yet those who left his small room often walked away lighter, as if something had been lifted not by words, but by presence. One evening, a troubled monk named Ren came to him. Ren had been fighting with his own mind shadows of past mistakes, fears about the future, regrets that clung like smoke. He had meditated, fasted, recited the sutras until his throat went dry. But still, the shadows followed him. He entered the master's room just before sunset. The walls glowed with the golden light of a fading day, and the shadows in the corners lengthened like silent companions. The master was sitting in his usual place, waiting, as if he had known Ren would come. Ren bowed deeply. "Master, I cannot escape my thoughts." I try to clear them, but they return. Dark thoughts, heavy ones. I feel ashamed just bringing them here." The master said nothing. He only gestured for Ren to sit. Between them, the shadows stretched along the floor. Minutes passed. The room was quiet. Then the master finally spoke, his voice soft as dusk. "Have you ever watched a shadow move?" Ren looked up, confused. "They do not run," the master said. "They do not shout. They do not chase the light. They only follow, gently, wherever the light allows them to be." Ren looked at the shadows in the room, shifting slowly as the sun moved behind the mountain. They weren't ugly. They weren't frightening. They were just there. "The mind casts shadows," the master continued. "But we don't need to fight them. We can sit with them, listen to them. And in time they soften. Not because we destroy them, but because we stop fearing them." Ren said nothing, but something inside him loosened. For the first time, he let the shadows sit beside him without shame, without struggle. And in their quiet company, he began to feel peace. Moral of the story: not all healing comes from light alone. Sometimes, peace is found by sitting gently with our shadows, listening, not running, and letting them teach us what fear never could. The next story is called The Path Between the Pines. There was a narrow path that wound quietly through a forest of tall pine trees. It wasn't marked on any map, nor did it lead to a famous temple or shrine. Still, the ground was smooth, as if many feet had traveled it over the years. The wind moved through the needles like soft whispers, and the scent of pine and earth lingered in the air like an old memory. A monk from a distant temple came upon this path while walking without direction, hoping to clear his thoughts. His mind had been heavy with questions about purpose, progress, enlightenment. No matter how much he studied, no matter how long he sat in meditation, a part of him still felt far from peace. As he stepped onto the forest path, the quiet was immediate and complete. No bells, no voices, only the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional rustle of a bird taking flight. He walked slowly. At first, he tried to think his way through the silence. He recited sutras in his mind. He reflected on teachings, but the forest offered no replies, no revelations. Just trees standing tall, unmoving, while the path continued, soft and steady beneath him. Eventually, his thoughts grew tired. He stopped trying to understand the silence and began to feel it. Each step became slower, more aware. The light filtered through the pines in golden patterns, and the air wrapped around him like a robe. He no longer cared where the path led. Hours passed, or perhaps just minutes, he couldn't tell anymore. But something changed. His chest, once tight with striving, loosened. His breathing deepened. A quiet joy bloomed in him, not from solving anything, but from walking without needing to arrive. And then, as the trees began to thin and the sky widened, he understood. This path had never been about reaching something. It had always been about returning to breath, to step, to presence. He turned back, not because he was lost, but because he was found. Moral of the story: some paths are not meant to take us forward, they are meant to bring us back to ourselves. When we walk without seeking, the stillness between each step becomes the destination. The next story is called The Answer in the Ripple. In the center of the monastery garden was a round, still pond. No fish swam in it, no lilies floated. It was simple, clear water and smooth stones, surrounded by moss and silence. Many monks passed by without stopping, but the oldest ones always paused, even if only for a moment. A young monk, struggling with doubt, began visiting the pond each morning. His teacher had given him no new scriptures, no chants, no advice, only one sentence: go to the pond, watch, wait. At first, the monk saw nothing special. The water just sat there. No answers rose from it. No visions appeared. His thoughts kept racing. Am I doing it wrong? Is this a test? What am I missing? On the fifth morning, he sat longer than usual. The wind was soft, the air warm. He picked up a small pebble and dropped it into the center of the water. The ripples spread out in perfect rings, one after another, until it reached the edge and disappeared. Then silence again. He stared, eyes fixed, mind suddenly quiet. The ripple had not forced the water to move, it had simply touched it, and the water responded. Then it returned to stillness, without clinging to the movement or trying to hold on to the wave. He picked up another pebble and dropped it. Again, the ripple moved, then faded, and he suddenly felt something stir in his chest knot, a thought, not an answer, but a knowing. All this time, he had been trying to force clarity, to push away confusion, to make peace happen. But the pond wasn't peaceful because it avoided disturbance, it was peaceful because it allowed everything, and then let it go. The ripples came and passed. The stillness remained. That afternoon, he returned to his teacher and bowed deeply. The teacher smiled. "You saw it, didn't you?" The monk nodded. "I didn't find the answer," he said quietly, "but I watched it pass through." Moral of the story: peace isn't found in avoiding disturbance. It's found in allowing life to ripple through us without resistance and trusting that, in time, stillness always returns. As the final words settle like mist over still water, may the echoes of these stories continue to move gently through your mind, soft as dew, steady as breath, and quiet as the flame that does not flicker. From the bamboo that bent in the storm to the bell that sang without a hand, from feathers on meditation mats to whispers of wind-turned sutras, these tales were not just stories but invitations to let go, to be still, to listen. Let these teachings carry you like clouds through the night, offering not answers, but peace. A peace born not of escaping life, but of resting gently within it. If a story touched your heart or helped you breathe a little easier, share it in the comments below. Your reflections may be the next ripple that brings calm to someone else's night. And if you wish to carry more of this quiet light into your life, don't forget to subscribe. More calm moments are waiting for you, one breath, one story, one still night at a time. Sleep well, stay soft, and return anytime you need the silence to speak again.